Man's Psyche, The Two Worlds by Àrmunn. Introduction. Kazumbo, a very wise and bright young man, whom I have the privilege of knowing, convinced me to commit my observations on the human psyche to literary form. Do make note of that I am not an academic, for I have long perceived the inherent limitations of academia, given its promoted roots. Therefore, embarking upon this process ran somewhat counter to my natural inclination as a dialogist, to me towards their publication in text, perhaps for this work to stand as a companion to my many recorded conversations on the subject and other related matters. He was not the first to suggest it, but he was certainly the most convincing, catching me in the appropriate frame of mind to take in the idea as more acceptable than that at other times. Thus I accepted both the proposition and his help in conveying through such a one-way format how I have come to see the human psyche, the nature of its problems, and possible solutions that can only be realised and applied at an individual level. My explorations began at the religious, spiritual level, with incursions into Kardec's Spiritism, then Tibetan branches of Vajrayana and Theravada Buddhism. I almost went on to be ordained as a monk, but was kept from it by a very stern personal synchronicity, which set me on a very different and, in my retrospective observation, far more fruitful path. Yet looking back, the motivation behind my observant disposition was not the attainment of something higher, for I somehow felt even then that this state was already there, right with and by me. I discovered there was no need to strive toward it. What is required is simply to recognise its presence, structure, and function. Most certainly this was part of the discovery of my individual vocation, to be able to peek beyond the mundane workings of scripted humanity and find the light submerged in that darkness. I do not presume at all that there is the one path, even though I did look for it. What I found, however, was how the human psyche works, and that highlighted, despite the healthy human gregarious nature, how each problem and solution is entirely individual. Consider this for a moment. Given the sheer individual nature of each one position, there is no unifying therapeutic formula or remedy. This implies that an individual has to take the reins of their own responsibility, which had been outsourced for so long, I found out, and that responsibility was outsourced exactly to the parts of ourselves that had been reflected back onto us, albeit, by the fact of their very misplacement, unhealthily. This set of unhealthy reflections, shadow projections, proved to be a very important observation that I had drawn by deeply contemplating the matter of evil. This became the central point of my pursuits and observations as soon as the evident question was set before me. What is evil, and where does it come from? Once the obvious inference emerged that there can only be evil if good is also present, I realised that it could never be an external and independent duality. That is, that both good and evil have to share and originate from the same source. What source is that? Christianity. Even Kardec's branch is quite Manichaean in this regard, viewing evil as a separate and opposing force to good. However, if God is the one source of creation, then how and why would the devil have emerged if Lucifer rebelled by impetus of his own free will against that of God's? Then how could a creation ever decide to oppose its own nature? Also, Buddhism, that, putting it simplistically, sees evil as ignorance, has inherently the same dualistic view. For if all suffering is illusion stemming from ignorance, Why should illusion itself manifest as ignorance rather than wisdom? In other words, why wouldn't it manifest good and not evil? It becomes obvious that good and evil have a dependent relationship with one another, reflecting the missing, misplaced aspects of one another. Also, following the Christian view, how could God not be responsible for the devil and all inherent evil? After all, Christ in the Gospel of John states that his Father, God, created everything. Quote, "Through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made," unquote, John 1:3. Buddhism safeguarded this avenue of discussion, either claiming that there was no beginning, and of course blaming human ignorance for asking such a question. Interestingly, ignorance is the Buddhist version of evil, or by presenting the Buddha's famous poisoned arrow parable in response to the monk Malankiyapata, who threatened to renounce his teachings if he did not answer satisfactorily. Quote, "It's just as if a man were wounded with an arrow thickly smeared in poison. His friends and companions, kinsmen and relatives would provide him with a surgeon, and the man would say, quote, 'I won't have this arrow removed until I know whether the man who wounded me was a noble warrior, a priest, a merchant, or a worker,' unquote. He would say, quote, 'I won't have this arrow removed until I know the given name and clan name of the man who wounded me, until I know whether he was tall, medium, or short, until I know whether he was dark, ruddy brown, or golden coloured, until I know his home village, town, or city, until I know whether the bow with which I was wounded was a longbow or a crossbow, until I know whether the bowstring with which I was wounded was fibre, bamboo, threads, sinew, hemp, or bark, until I know whether the shaft with which I was wounded was wild or cultivated, until I know whether the feathers of the shaft with which I was wounded were those of a vulture, a stork, a hawk, a peacock, or another bird, until I know whether the shaft with which I was wounded was bound with the sinew of an ox, a water buffalo, a langur, or a monkey. He would say, quote, 'I won't have this arrow removed until I know whether the shaft with which I was wounded was that of a common arrow, a curved arrow, a barbed, a calf-toothed, or an oleander arrow,' unquote. The man would die and those things would still remain unknown to him," unquote. If you are a Buddhist now, as I was many years ago, you will say that my pursuits are therefore ignorant and unworthy, which is as much of a self-referential argument. It is true because the starting premise is taken as true, as the Christian view of the devil did it. Regardless, this was not satisfactory to me, for one thing would be a contextual emergency that required swift action, such as healing the poison. Another, quite different, would be to scale it up and deny that it is of no consequence to discover the archer, the nature of the bow, and of the arrow, because that would not allow me to prevent another arrow from being fired at the man again, given a different opportunity. I would accept emergency healing for the immediate threat, but that would not prevent me from trying to discover the process that led me to that state, to ensure it wouldn't happen again. As the Buddha is written to have told Malankiyapata, that he cared not whether the disciple followed him or not, for truth requires no following. I see that, consequently. Truth would not require an external Buddha to convey it, especially not if that truth did not come clean on the intricacies required to resolve these matters once and for all, and not merely by conviction. Likewise, God would not require an external Christ to convey his message, certainly not through grotesque torture and death after having revealed such elevated qualities. Both the Christian and Buddhist explanations for the origin of evil remained unsatisfactory to me until I realized that the problem lay in their externalization. That being, both Christ and Buddha are treated as external, even historical, figures, rather than as symbolic metaphors for processes within the human psyche. This recognition, as will become evident in later sections, proves to be an important aspect of the discussion. I then arrived at Christian Gnosticism, particularly the Nag Hammadi scrolls, discovered in 1945 under very suspicious circumstances, where actually Christianity and Buddhism sort of coalesced. I later found this was no organic accident, but a narrative literary device imposed by Theosophy. Christian Gnosticism views the created world as the works of an entity that claims to be God, therefore claims to be truth, and it is not. It presents, therefore, the devil Yaldabaoth, the demiurge or artificer, the architect, as the creator of the world, in opposition to the Father, the true God. This enticed my curiosity for years. Eventually, however, once all the mystery and mysticism is stripped away, I saw the same problem as before. If Yaldabaoth created evil, and if Yaldabaoth came from Sophia, according to the earlier Pistis Sophia text and confirmed by the Nag Hammadi texts, and if Sophia emanated from God, then God had Yaldabaoth as a principle in himself, a principle that carried over to Sophia and eventually manifested as Yaldabaoth. Consequently, God was still responsible for evil, and evil could not, therefore, come from an external opposer. This realization about the responsibility of God, or of truth in Buddhism, confirmed to me a suspicion that I had carried with me over the years, that it is key to treat these depictions, be it Christian or Buddhist, as metaphors for something internal and not as external accounts. Christ and Buddha both narratively acted as middlemen characters between a father or truth that could not directly manifest, being pure potential of all things, be it seen as good or as evil, and his created man. How could this be translated into the human psyche? What would it tell me of the issue of the origin of evil and its workings? Ultimately, that was the focus of my contemplations from then on, eventually leading me to compose the model I henceforth attempt to present in writing. Such contemplations led me to recognize the central importance of individual responsibility, and to understand the roles of self-deceit, perception, rejection, projection, and reflection in the delusional state of the human psyche, as well as the conditions necessary to recover from it. There is not, and will never be, I found, a one-size-fits-all formula, a spiritual pill that clears all illness. What I found was a set of requirements for the human psyche to function in a healthy manner, thus removing delusion. Each case is individual, each context its own, and each solution a particular. Albeit, such an approach will not appeal to those seeking a quick remedy for the poisoned arrow. To them, I would readily recommend whichever form of Buddhism or Christianity best suits their personal disposition. Rather, these reflections are directed toward those who, like myself, seek a more comprehensive understanding of the issues underlying such poisons. Only recently I came across a passage from Deja Woodard on a blog that expressed this wisdom beautifully. Quote, "I find, as with most toxins and venoms, that the cure is hidden within the poison," unquote. I find it to be quite so myself. The venom not only presents the origin of the issue, of the arrow in the parable, but also contains in itself the cure. If you feel so inclined, travel with me as I present my findings, treating them not as a finished product or any absolute, but the notes of one who has sought and is still seeking, not to achieve heaven's bliss, not to achieve nibbana's emptiness, not to escape a perceived demiurgic trap, as all of these imply internal rejections, but to attempt wholeness instead. Chapter 2. The Theatre of Life and Shadow Play. The common thread uniting all who, from whatever path or perspective, seek beyond the mundane is a growing sense and intuition that something in the world we inhabit and in the lives we lead is profoundly off. Although this is also linked with the question of evil and its origins, it is not a mere observation of its existence, but instead a deeper sense that, intertwined with all our experience, is a facade, an illusion, a veil, that seems only perceived by those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Often we find ourselves moving without actual volition, reacting without actual perception, thinking without actual consciousness. For Buddhism, this is Maya, the illusion of physical existence, in that regard very similar, and I would postulate intentionally so, to the Christian Gnostic view of the material trap of the demiurge. Even traditional Christianity views the world as an antithesis of God. Quote, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world." 1 John 2, verses 15 to 17. Quote, "You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world means enmity against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God," unquote. James 4:4. Hence the question emerges, why is there this opposition between this world and the source of creation? And also, why is it equated to matter by all the traditions mentioned? After all, if all creation was produced by God, then matter is included, and it should, therefore, follow that it is a useful achievement, not in opposition to the Creator. Even in Buddhism, which does not conveniently define creation or origins plainly, why is dukkha, suffering, which is one of its core propositions, associated with matter as well? This is incorrect and, in my observation, purposeful misinterpretation of what this world is defined as. To view matter as an enemy or opponent, or at least its field of operations, is to go down a road that inevitably leads to self-denial, self-rejection. Although these traditions promote, in one way or another, that very self-denial as a virtue, the question must be asked, what is that self that is being denied? Could it be that they vie to deny the very point of connection to who we are as beings, created or otherwise, and therefore to our divinity? These questions wandered around me for years, and I wrestled with them enough to reach a few insights that I hope may be useful to someone. Note how Christianity defines this world as, for instance, quote, "the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life," unquote. Likewise, Buddhism defines it along the same lines, speaking of lower desires for gratification that is never permanent, as one of the causes not only of suffering, but also of the maintenance of one within that very world. Note as well how Christian Gnosticism describes the tricks of the archons under the rule of the demiurge to instill worldly temptation as a means to keep the soul trapped in its maze. Yet, what really is this maze, this illusion, this world? Is it materiality in itself, or is it perception imposed upon matter? When we hear of gluttony, for instance, or the equivalent desire for greed or sensual attachment, are we actually listening to a reference to the material world, or to a perceived experience in it? After all, is hunger ignorance or sin, or an illusion? No, I would say hunger is, well, just hunger, a need inherent to existence. Yet gluttony is something else. That is actually not directly related to that need. It is the anxiety about hunger. It is the tension of an aspect of the mind to ensure that hunger is never felt, an inability to cope with the unexpected and unpredictable nature of existence, A glutton does not become one through direct addiction to the material food, but by his perception of it, through the senses, and his pondering on the lack of it. It is the idea that this meal might be the last, or that this delicious flavour may never be experienced again, that stresses something in the mind to seek it out as often as possible, as it attempts to reduce the unpredictability of the meals in this example. Consider the farm, not as a critique of agriculture, but as an illustration. A farm seeks to make food predictable, consequently potentially leading to gluttony, through that tension mentioned above. So, is it truly the material world that is being referred to? Is it really physicality per se? Or is this world actually better defined as a perception of it, coupled with tensions that arise from natural unpredictability, at least as far as the lower mind is concerned? Even Christ is vehement in addressing this anxiety. Quote, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" Unquote. Matthew 6, verses 25 to 27. And just before he had stated, quote, "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon, or money." Matthew 6, verses 24. It seems then that this world is not the physical existence per se, but the concern, lack of faith, about unpredictability that generates secondary constructs such as, for instance, money, which is perceived as energy, but is in fact an arbitrary agreement regulating access to the fulfillment of needs, legitimate or not, natural or artificial. We here see already the contradiction, and how perhaps, I postulate, it is not the physical world itself that is the illusory world, opposing God or the Dharma, but a false perception superimposed on it by a tension. If so, where does that tension come from? Why does the mind self-delude in this manner? Why do constructs, agreements, and abstractions become more important than natural existence? And also, why has physicality itself been made the culprit? Well, the shorter answer is because it has been perceptually rejected and, consequently, removed from its natural place in the order of the psyche. The unsound logic, still using gluttony as a mere example and in too broad a sense, is something like, quote, "I suffer this anxiety about hunger because I am material and need to eat. I consequently eat too much due to this overcompensating impulse. This leads to gluttony, to an addiction that inevitably brings consequence. Since hunger stems from being a physical entity, physicality itself is the enemy of my well-being," unquote. It can be noted that Buddhism and Christian Gnosticism suffer from the same fallacy. Neither truly accommodate the notion that physical existence may serve as part of a natural useful process due to exactly the problem of need that leads to the attachment and addiction. Is it, however, necessarily so? Is it truly one leading inevitably to the other? My observation is that no, not necessarily, although it is undeniable that it may and often does. Thus, given this, how can this chain of delusion emerge? That is what we will try to dig into in the longer answer, which is the subject matter of this book. Given the distinction made between actual physicality and the perception and constructs based upon it, that quote-unquote world, let us use metaphor to better convey how this fits into the actual experience of reality. Let us imagine that natural physicality is an improvised theatre play performed out in the open. This means the characters are played by actors that do not follow any pre-written text, but improvise their lines and actions as the context emerges fluidly and organically. It does not mean necessarily that there is no conductor for the actor, although this term refers mainly to music, merely that this conductor is himself too interacting with the play and responding to it as it happens and guiding the actor to play the character as it goes. So you see a distinction between conductor, actor, and character that nonetheless work together in harmony. Imagine then that from within the play something emerges, a misperception caused by tension and anxiety, which through rejection causes the character to stop responding to or following the actor's instructions, replacing him as a source of guidance with a partial projection of it, a shadow. This shadow is a projection of natural aspects of the actor and character that were deemed undesirable by the character in the play. For example, using the gluttony example of before, the character rejected the idea of feeling hunger as a part of the play. That rejection caused an incision between the actual actor and a part of his image as projected by the character. This causes a new command in the play, quote, "We must no longer feel hunger, we must routinely eat," unquote, which in turn generates desires, decisions, and actions that align not with the completely improvised play that implies unpredictability, but with a new scripted one. Metaphorically, from then on, the open stage is enclosed by these shadows that spread and grow and dim it to eventual utter darkness. Inevitably, the improvisation stops, for it can no longer be performed in the dark enclosure, and a new medium emerges, scripted cinema. Onto the dark walls of the enclosure are projected entire pre-scripted movies with planned roles, artificial objectives, and coordinated action. The only light seen in the now dark room is that of the projection of these scripts. Consequently, the natural improvised play and the connection to the organic actor playing that character first becomes a memory and is eventually forgotten altogether. The loss of the connection to the actor, and consequently to the conductor, is then a new matter of tension and anxiety for the character, as a feeling of abandonment takes it over. Incompetent as it is to play a role it is not equipped to, the character scripts itself more and more, following the directions of this projected partial actor, now grotesquely twisted towards this feeling of urgency and need for predictability. Then the outsourcing of responsibility occurs. Authority figures emerge and become externalized superstar actors themselves. Scripts become formulaic and predictable, offering a sense of inorganic security as long as the character remains within its own projected movie. This much simplified example shows one hypothetical worldview formation origin. Yet, ultimately, there are many scripted false subjective worlds in perception, even if only one actual organic world is objective. In summary, and for clarity, I will list below the components of the metaphor used. Rest assured, I will later on clarify some of these terms. Firstly, improvised theatre play. That is, organic physical existence guided by each individual essential self. Secondly, conductor, the individual essential self or essence. Thirdly, actor, that is the individual ego. Fourthly, character, the mind character. Fifthly, shadow, that is the internal aspects related to the external experience, rejected by the mind character and projected onto reality, generating an internal, amalgamated ego surrogate. There is another type of shadow, the reflected one, that will also be discussed further on. And sixthly, scripted cinema. That is, artificial scripted existence guided by the need for predictability from a mind character while following a shadow surrogate ego, or an external counterpart, such as an authority figure, a false worldview. The metaphorical scenario above, although entirely fictional, conveys what has happened to man's psyche in my view, first individually, then consequently, collectively. All we need is a good hard look at ourselves and those around us to see this externally imposed worldview present there as a monolith of perception, as a veil covering our eyes to the connection with the conductor via the actor. A more plausible meaning to the world as opponent, as described by the previously mentioned traditions, can easily be inferred. In the metaphor used, it would be the shadowy veil, this web of anxiety and need, that turned improvisation into scripts, creativity into safe molds, life into mere automatic animation of role-playing. This is the opponent in my view, and it is not an external one, for it emerged from the misperceptions within, coupled with the rejection of natural setting. Yet, is the character in the metaphor to blame? Is the actor the conductor? Firstly, I would say that it is not a blame game, but one of responsibility. After all, it was the shirking of responsibility given in to the fears that caused rejection and projection, and brought about the matter in the first place. After all, a need is a need. It is neither good nor evil, but the perception of it from a qualitative judgment point of view creates an internal opponent that inevitably externalizes. This is, in my observation, the reason why the symbolic metaphors of religion are made literal. As soon as you remove the symbol and make it concrete and external, it loses its message, and the receiver, if converted, becomes entirely predictable, actually further losing the connection that perhaps the original metaphorical tale tried to re-establish. Chapter 3. The Structure of Man's Psyche. I've addressed how the origins of a false worldview may have come about. Still, the actual effects of a false world installed on man, entirely perception-based, can only truly be realised by understanding also how man's psyche is naturally structured, at least how I observe it to be so, as indicated before. Falsehood needs to not only include, but also mimic innately recognisable elements of the organic world. This includes the presence of unpredictability as a part of life. This mimicry fabricates a perception of that randomness, skewed perceptually just enough to make acceptable a ritualised, compartmentalised, and scripted role-playing substitute world. For instance, it may present an event as unexpected to its psychological adherents below, when it was actually entirely planned and performed from above. Whenever an actual unexpected incident does occur, one that was not in the plans and scripts of the worldview management, it is quickly written in, included within the shared framework to maintain its narrative continuity and integrity. Thus, the worldview offers increased predictability, sold under the mantra of order and security, pretending to be as legitimate as the original. To do so, it has to first convince that organic nature is chaotic and adversarial to man, or, as more recently done, that man is adversarial to nature. It has, therefore, to misplace man as an external invader to organic nature, to pit these two sides as opponents. The argument is, at its foundation, that if nature wins by the action of its unpredictability, man dies, and that if man wins by the action of his imposed predictability, nature dies. It floods, no pun intended, the imagination with deluges and other cataclysms that eradicated man because he, supposedly, misbehaved long ago. And this pattern is not confined to formal religion. It is consistently a form of imposed and implicit misanthropy. This is not to affirm that there were never any such cataclysmic events, yet, if they occurred, they were part of organic nature and inherently also part of man, not entirely external because of man. Man is an integral part of the natural world, and his intelligence implies that he will build and develop technology. That too is part of nature, not separate from it. Yet the false worlds always place man outside of it, distinct, alien, even. Regarding the cataclysms in Christianity, God sent the deluge to kill man for not respecting the laws that were set for him. In Buddhism, lack of adherence to the Dharma brings about 7 disasters, as presented in the Benevolent King Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. Similarly, in science, as the new collectively introduced religion, purported beings, such as the dinosaurs and even supposed branches of pre-man, due to being obsolete, were taken out by an ancient asteroid impact or any such other natural devices. Presently, already with man supposedly at the peak of his insolent disrespect for Mother Nature, a personification of the Titan Gaia from Hellenic myths, nature supposedly changes its climate to no longer nurture and accommodate him, but threatening his destruction. I will have to here correct the term science, as it would be better called scientism, because although it carries the name of science, it still functions within a religious framework, as will be evident. In summary, we compare these examples as such. 1. Christianity. Man breaks God's laws. God causes a deluge because of man's misbehaviour. 2. Buddhism. Man does not follow Dharma. His consequent karma causes 7 disasters. 3. Scientism. Before man, dinosaurs and other beings became obsolete in nature. An unpredictable natural asteroid causes their extinction. 4. Scientism. With man, man exploits nature and causes irreparable damage to it. Nature's climate changes, which threatens to destroy man. In recent history, no other ideology or worldview managed to seep into broadly differentiated religions and cultures as much as scientism was able to, wearing the mask of science, a term derived from the Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, and that is also a part of the word conscience. This helped sell it as a new truth that was able to, in general, replace the old truths. Not to say that the old truths were organically true, but merely that a replacement of them took place, a false one for another. If in doubt still about that replacement taking place, note how even many a devout religious or spiritual individual resorts to scientism for guidance. Medicine replaced ritual is the prevalent superstition, an example among many others. The distinction between science and scientism is therefore evident as the same disparity that was previously defined between the organic world and a false world. Man is always either seen in relation to organic nature as a visitor or a conqueror, but never quite belonging to it. This is a worldview. In fact, it is presented as being both, the instrument of order and of chaos in it. The interesting, observable fact is that any actual friction between man and nature has always emerged as a product of one such false perceived worlds in his mind, prompting programmed behaviour rather than anything innate to man himself. Even so, man has neither the innate ability, power or ambition to actually do any irreparable damage or meaningful contention with the nature around him, but he can surely do hopeless damage to himself, even shatter his psyche. Careful observation shows that nature is constantly restoring a point of equilibrium by itself, thus implying that an order essential to it is inherent and that any damage done is overcome in time. It is not chaotic but self-ordered, even if that order is beyond man's perceptual limitations. Regardless of his self-considerations, man has no power to truly disrupt that ordering mechanism of nature. Conversely, because it holds a balance between order and chaos, nature is also able to present itself unexpectedly, following that mentioned implied order that is, at times, too imperceptible for man's senses or comprehension. Man has no power to truly order that unexpectedness either. Yet, all it takes for a sense of security, for a sense of predictability, is the perception, the belief, that man can both order the chaos and also bring chaos to the order. This imposed perception thus alternately elevates man to the state of a god, or lowers him to the state of a devil, regardless of which the central point is that man has to be presented as external to nature itself. A consequent effect of this is that if man sees himself as a god, or with God, then nature belongs to the devil. Inversely, if man sees himself as a devil, or with the devil, then nature belongs to God. Both these cases cause a certain feeling of helplessness running in the background. 1. If nature is the devil's and man is with God, then nature is constantly and eternally, trying to corrupt man. 2. If nature is God's and man is with the devil, then nature is constantly and eternally trying to condemn man. By therefore placing man in nature, but not as a harmonious part of it, a disconnection begins to occur inside the psyche. During this conflict process, this false, externally imposed estrangement imitates the state of abandonment felt by the mind character after severing connection with his ego. An innate, organic authority is no longer paid attention to, and that opens a vacuum that may be then filled by an external replacement. Man stops seeing the world as it objectively is, and is able to accept a perceptual, subjective false world. Still, such a dichotomy is not the entirety of the foundational process. There is a third part that also always has to be presented by an imposed worldview, a balancing element, a soothing element, a resolving element, and that, in one way or another, is an element that leads to the full belief in the ritualized, false world, regardless of the point of view. An obvious example of that third resolving element, in a structural sense, is the inclusion of a religious figurehead whose given function is to exactly maintain that worldview's integrity and prevent the disaster of its collapse. In the Catholic world, the Pope is chosen by God to represent Christ amongst Christians, oversee their morality, and to pray as an intercessor for all humanity. If the Pope doesn't intercede well for, or is himself corrupted, then humanity deviates and suffers the wrath of God accordingly. In the Buddhist world, whose most purposeful, publicized branch has been the Tibetan Vajrayana, the figurehead is widely known as the Dalai Lama. He is an incarnation of Avalokitesvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, here to offer moral guidance towards the Dharma and promote enlightenment. If the Dalai Lama was to cease to perform his functions, then bad karma would bring about terrible consequences to the world, even the aforementioned 7 disasters. Similarly, just so the same likeness is appreciated, in the Japanese Shinto world, the emperor is a descendant of the creator goddess Amaterasu that represents her among all Japanese and Shintoists. His spiritual function is to oversee their morality and perform several rituals and prayers on specific cyclical times to intercede with the gods to appease them in relation to the Japanese population. If the emperor doesn't perform these rituals and prayers, then the gods will release cataclysmic earthquakes, tsunamis, or droughts. To understand that this likeness of process is not limited to formal religion, see how, for instance, the Director General of the World Health Organization is chosen and elected among the academic Illuminati, also no pun intended, of each member state to oversee humanity's health, promote their proper health habits, and ensure the distribution and access to remedial metaphorical Eucharists, medicine, that intercede with natural biology to prevent man from suffering cataclysmic diseases or to resolve them quickly as they emerge. If the Director General is lax on his duties, then mankind can develop bad health habits and be hit by the wrath of an opposing natural world. That is, if the WHO leader allows man to misbehave, Mother Nature, Gaia, will make them sick and kill them. Chess is the preferred game of mind characters guided by a projected shadow. It is entirely logical and binary, black and white. Played on a closed board within controlled parameters, chance plays no role in it. Unpredictability is excluded by design. Moreover, it can only proceed if both sides agree upon the same rules. Chess is therefore an outstanding metaphor for the false, imposed, and programmed worldview. It is strategic in nature. Each player seeks to attack the enemy's king while protecting his own. For a winner to emerge, the opponent's king must be trapped under threat, for without threat there is stalemate. But the king itself is never captured or killed. By accepting a world imposed upon the organic, man has agreed to psychologically pretend he is a chess piece, restricted in his organic individuality, yet granted a limited freedom of movement and a symbolic importance. Everyone desires to be a king, and no one a pawn, yet both are confined within the same make-believe game. Psychologically, the individual is not permitted to leave the board. Any attempt to do so provokes a visceral reaction from his peers, who instinctively defend the integrity of the game. The primal reason for having accepted the game is thus reinforced. To preserve the illusion of security, all must remain within the agreement, lest the feared unexpected emerge, the very cataclysms introduced by the worldview itself. As with every utopia, everyone must cooperate within it, or it ceases to function. From within the board, one's view, whether from a white or black square, as a king or as a pawn, there appears to be only one player, or at least a coordination of players, so unified in purpose that they act as a single mind. The purpose of this chess game, as it relates to the false worlds of perception and belief, is not to win in the traditional sense. The game is won precisely for as long as it continues to be played. I have stated that every false world must mimic organic reality, for that is the only realm to which man is innately connected. Let us now, then, examine how I view the natural structure of the psyche. The conscious. Unlike academic psychology that associates the conscious with the direct sentience of the mind, my view is reversed. As I observe, the conscious is actually the traditional subconscious, and vice versa. The reasons for it are that, 1. I observe that the traditional subconscious, sub meaning under, is not below, but above direct sentience, due to its increased authority over the psychological processes. And 2, it contains far more conscious material, consciousness, than its counterpart. Consciousness comes from the Latin con plus scientia, which translates as with knowledge, with the added ness suffix. As is easily verifiable even by traditional psychology, the area with the most knowledge content of the two is the one usually branded as sub. Moreover, that traditional sub-area is known to have far more authority or importance in the psychological processes than the other. The traditional sub influences the other far more than the other way around. Freud and Jung, for instance, both focus on the subconscious, albeit very differently, as the greater authority of the psyche, the prime motivator of behaviour. whose content is an endless pool of memory and acquired knowledge, even false ones. Thus, whenever you read me address the conscious, I will actually be referring to the traditional subconscious, and when I refer to subconscious, I am addressing the traditional conscious. Conscious, the traditional subconscious, has more knowledge and is higher in authority. Subconscious, the traditional conscious, has less knowledge and is lower in authority. The conscious is the area closest to the essential self or essence, which is the purest form of consciousness and potential for that individual, and also its psychological source. Within the conscious lies the memory room, where all memories are stored, even those that are false, as we will see, and also what I call the throne room, a place where the ego forms and dwells. Let us then take a look at these components. Is the entire potential for a specific individuality. It is unmanifested, yet it is the source of all the individual's psyche. It is a sort of organic blueprint, a set of timeless archetypes that will define positions, vocations, and traits. It has no form, not even in the conceptual sense, yet I have chosen a circle to represent it as it seems the most appropriate for its traits. Being the originator of all the individual's psychological traits, yet absent from perception or manifestation within the mind, it is the organic equivalent that has been defined as God. In Christianity, it is the Father, whose state is heaven. In Buddhism, it is the Dharma, whose state is Nibbana. In scientism, it is the knowledge of nature, whose state is enlightenment. Or reason, as depicted in the Age of Enlightenment, purest organic pool of potentials. It is intangible, immutable, and independent. It could also be equated with absolute truth, in the sense that it stands on its own, regardless of perception. Although the individual essence lies outside the psyche proper, it is the generator of the psyche's field, wherein all of the other subsequent elements arise in function and manifestation. In the diagram above, this field is the triangle below it. It is merely a representation, yes, but one that shows how the false worldviews have mimicked this concept as well, in the pyramid form, and even more evidently, in the pyramid with the missing capstone and the all-seeing eye over it, but not a part of it. Such a depiction is a copy that intends to offer recognition and legitimacy to the false structure. Still, the form is not arbitrary. It links accurately to the organic psyche. The closer a psychological element gets to the essence, the less manifested metaphorical space is found there, even though pure and organic consciousness content is increased and more compact, less differentiated. So the triangle in 2D and the pyramid in 3D try to depict a mimicry of this organic funneling, albeit in a much different way. In the organic psyche, the higher up and closer to the essence one goes, the more consciousness is found. In a collective worldview, the more elevated is one's position, the more one is knowledgeable of the scale of falsehood of that worldview that provides fabricated order and security, or predictability. It is obvious, therefore, that the originators, the writers and architects of the false worldview are not in it, psychologically, but above it, both in knowledge of it and authority over it. It is for this reason that all man-made hierarchies follow this design. A few men contrive it and are entirely knowledgeable of it, remaining therefore outside of it, and from that position regulate it and lead it. These are men who have realized the workings of reality in a deeper way and, driven by that triggering tension against unpredictability that I touched upon before, decided to create collective psychological constructs to mitigate it through power. They assume within the worldview the aspect and state of gods, both in the monotheistic and polytheistic types, both benevolent and malevolent, but always powerful way beyond man, or of an originating truth such as Dharma, having themselves created the set of fabricated truths and moral rules for it. Again, I remind the reader, this is not to say that there isn't an objective truth. It is to state instead that this truth was replicated, as much as it was possibly perceived by the writers, into a manageable and predictable format. Also, I do see these writers or false worlds as knowledgeable men. I emphasize not any supernatural entity. This is key. The pure essence is, as presented, outside of the psyche itself, despite being its originator. It generates, therefore, a representative for itself in the psyche. Thus, any of its worldview copies have to include such a representative as well, visible or otherwise, to cause the desired recognition and acceptance by man in general. The ego is a Latin word that translates as I or me. In academic psychology, the ego is incumbent of analysing the world according to the pleasure principle or the reality principle, depending on its stage. The pleasure principle is the urge to satisfy bodily needs and avoid pain, and in Freudian psychoanalysis, it is regulated by the id. The id, according to Freud, is the body's awareness of these needs, and it drives unrelenting pursuit to fulfill them. The reality principle, in contrast, balances these id urges with reason, matching them onto the background of culture, education, and society, or the collective. Although this isn't not entirely wrong by any means, I have some distinctions to make in regards to how I observe it. I also view the ego as a bridge, though not between the id, the individual body, and the superego, the internalized representation of the collective, as traditionally conceived. Rather, it interconnects the essence, the individual's pure organic blueprint, and the mind character. As will be discussed later, this mind character may either arise naturally from within the ego, harmonizing with an organic external context, or be externally constructed by one of the previously mentioned worldviews, designed instead to mould the internal psyche to fit its imposed framework. As the only part directly connected to the individual's essence, the ego is always the legitimate authority within the psyche. It links up with the essence and down with the mind character, functioning both as a reality filter, distinguishing what is objective from what is subjective, what is true from what is false, and as a decision centre guided by the directives of the unmanifested individual essence. Metaphorically, the ego is, in my view, the organic source of wisdom, the authority of truth, and the legitimate ruler of that psyche. The ego is able to see through even intricate webs of deceit and extract the truth for an appropriate decision. Not only that, it is able to analyse the contents of the psyche for any misperception before allowing them to enter the memory room in the conscious. Going back to the gospel, as Christ is successful in redeeming and healing the people, he is actually not only healing their perception, but their false memories as well. He is reaching to the root of behaviour and thought to exorcise the false, demons and sin therein. If Christ is seen as an internal, metaphorical symbol, making him far more powerful to the psyche than a literal historical figure, then he is, in this model, the ego, the I, the self. Quote, Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Unquote. John 14, verses 5 to 6. In that passage, we see Thomas, one of the disciples, and so representing a mind character, asking Christ how they will know the way if they cannot see as clearly as Christ or the ego. Christ then answers that he is the way to the organic Father or essence's will. The truth, in contrast with any installed worldviews, able to see through them, and the life, the source of organic individual psychological life. This is the type of internal inquiry that is supposed to occur in a healthy psyche. The mind character asks the ego for guidance and defers to this authority for any important decisions, because the mind character knows that, being in contact with the essence, the ego sees farther, better, and knows what to do. In many New Age circles, which are not new and are actually always founded upon the principles of theosophy, this would be equivalent to the higher self. I, myself, have no problem with the term per se, but I do have a problem with theosophy, as it has been the religious blueprint for the next generation of the false worldview mask. The ego as a concept and as a word has been thoroughly mistreated and attacked by the collective worldviews. Once we realize the etymology of the word ego, I or me, we can immediately understand why. To muffle individuality by shutting down the mind character's connection to its legitimate truth filter and decision center. In the same way, Christ was attacked in the gospel by the mob, representing those external to the psyche, taken over by a worldview. Quote, "Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is it that struck you?' Matthew 26, verses 67 to 68. And, quote, "And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.'" Matthew 27, verses 39 to 40. Still, the attacks were not solely external, because one of the mind characters represented by the disciples went on to betray him. Quote, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went on to the chief priests and said, 'What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him," unquote. Matthew 26, verses 14 to 16, which led to his crucifixion, where his legitimate authority was mocked by the mob of worldview believers. Quote, "And twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand, and kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.'" Matthew 27, verses 29 to 30. King of the Jews. We can see easy correlations here in my view. The king represents the individual legitimate authority that intervenes, authority born directly from the Father, to clear up, redeem, and exorcise a false perception-based worldview. By doing that, he will also save the mind characters, bringing them back to alignment with their Father, or the individual essence, in other words. The Jews, in this case, represent the mind characters that are organically of that individual's mind, in contrast to those that have been produced from the external influence of the false worldview. Then, that very external mob, projected in the mind, eventually attacked the ego, Christ, within. With the help of a mind character addicted to the false perceived world, represented by Judas Iscariot, they gave the ego away to the psychological representation of the false authorities to cease the threat to that false worldview that made the world predictable. Judas Iscariot, the mind character betrayer, was under that very tension I discussed earlier in this work, in this case due to greed. Quote, "But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. John 12 verses 4 to 6. In my observation, the gospel entirely depicts an internal process within an individual's psyche, set in confrontation with the collective false worldview. This worldview has taken hold over the organic world as perceived from within that psyche, and when the ego awakens, it begins to correct misperceptions and expel false beliefs, sins and demons, until the worldview shuts it down. As the ego awakens in a mind under the influence of a false structure, it inevitably meets internal resistance, both from the internal representatives of that external structure, the metaphorical policeman in the mind, if you will, and from a mind character that has grown addicted to the world view through one or more of the tensions previously discussed. However, I perceive a very different ending to that story than the one that has reached us. The ego cannot be killed within the psyche, hence his resurrection. But salvation was not truly concluded in the narrative because the external worldview continued to reign over the mind. The ego would not promise to return sometime in the future. It would always be there, ready to become active again at any time. That aside, and returning to our depiction of the ego being the channel that connects the essence to the mind character, the ego is situated between the conscious of the essence and the subconscious of the mind characters. I call this placement, using the king analogy, the throne room. The throne room is accessible only to the legitimate ego. However, if the filter of the ego is inactive within the psyche, a representative of the surrogate, externalized authority may dwell immediately below, in the subconscious part I define as the backstage. This area is where all the mind characters are stored when they are not on the front stage, interacting directly with the external world. As the ego bridges the above with the below, I have chosen to represent it as a lozenge. The ego is therefore the part of the psyche able to perceive synchronicity, or in Christian terms, since I am using that metaphor, to discern prophecy. Due to its connection with the essence, it is the purest manifested aspect of the I, and as such, it does not use worded language, but communicates through meaningful perceptions of synchronicity, which require the attention of the mind character. Given that I have introduced several new concepts, I will place them all visually in the diagram below, which will be presented again later on. The memory room, as seen in the diagram, is placed in the conscious, just above the throne room where the ego resides. It stores neutrally all information, memories, knowledge, and experiences. In a healthy psyche, no information is stored there without the ego's approval through analysis. Or, if it was stored through misperception, it is then cyclically re-evaluated by the ego for validity. It seeks to extract and confirm verifiable facts, and to discard or resolve any content that does not hold up to organic reality. For example, a loud bang is heard, the body, at its lowest level, reacts and assumes a readiness posture regarding any possible threat. In a healthy psyche, the ego quickly analyzes the sound and the environment for clues. During the analysis, it determines that the dense clouds above produced thunder and that there is, therefore, no immediate threat, thus releasing the alert from the body. It then stores the information in the memory room, cataloguing that sound as thunder caused by weather, a sign that it may soon rain. From then on, Whenever a loud bang is heard, the memory of thunder is recalled, along with any other relevant ones from the memory room and compared. The ego then analyses and determines whether it was again thunder, another catalogued sound, or a new and different occurrence. If, however, the ego's analysis is bypassed and an external worldview is regulating, that same organic and natural thunder may instead be perceived as a sign of God's wrath, prompting worshipful behaviour toward that perception-based construct. Later on, I will offer others that explain how a false worldview may stage the imitation of an organic thunder to bypass the ego's analysis and rely solely on the mind character's lower grade analysis of a recollection stored in the memory room. For now, the important aspects to retain from the memory room are: 1. It is located in the conscious, so not directly browsable to the subconscious where mind characters function. 2. It stores all information, experiences and knowledge obtained, be it correct or incorrect. 3. In a healthy psyche, the ego, that is constantly in contact with the essence, is the filter, the analyzer of such occurrences before they are stored, and the appraiser or evaluator of previously stored ones. 4. Given that it stores all of that psyche's acquired experience and information, the memory room is the foundation source of both knowledge and belief, with the ego acting as the arbiter for the evaluation of facts. Let us now take a look at my view of the subconscious that academic psychology, as I stated before, calls the conscious. Next, the subconscious. Given the natural confusion that would emerge when reading this work, due to the traditional meaning of the term, I find it prudent to reiterate again that, to me, the traditional conscious of academic psychology is actually the subconscious for the reasons I presented previously. Conscious, traditional, subconscious has more knowledge and is higher in authority. Subconscious, traditional, conscious has less knowledge and is lower in authority. If still in confusion about the switch in terms, I recommend reading again the explanatory notes given in the previous section about the conscious. In my view, the subconscious is, therefore, where direct sentience resides. This means that it is where our perception of the interaction with the external, is located. By claiming this, I understand the ramifications of such a postulation. It would mean that what we consider waking life is actually less conscious, in the sense of with knowledge, con plus scientia, than the backdrop of it, including the ego and the memory room. Both the latter hold far more consciousness than the awake sentience. The memory room's content may not always be accurate or factual, but instead may contain belief and incorrect assumptions yet to be analysed by the ego. The ego, however, is not, in my view, corruptible. It can be muffled, in the sense of the connection of it being ignored and made dormant, but the ego itself, being a direct product or descendant of the essence or essential self, is always holding the manifested blueprint of true, organic, and objective individuality. It might be argued that individuality is subjective, which is valid and observable. However, in comparison, the collective has to be necessarily even more subjective, for it is capable of sharing memory room content among its individuals that has not yet been analysed by each unique internal ego, and therefore without the inherent validation of the organic essence. Unlike worldview beliefs, I see the individual man as innately capable of reason and prone to apply it when observing the organic world. It is then the collective, the imposed worldviews that, by indoctrination from the earliest age possible, deviate the individual from his capability, or this capability rather, toward irrationality, and uninformed belief. This is done gradually at first by mimetic absorption on the part of the child when observing the immediate surroundings and their immediate family. Soon, however, indoctrination turns into an actual game of reward and punishment, both inside and outside the familial circle. In my observation, a child is already born with an ego. That is, a representation and psychological manifestation of the potentials laid out by the essence. However, it is not born with any mind characters. These develop with input from the environment and context it finds, supposedly coupled with the output of that very ego. Yet early on, children are taught by reward and punishment to disregard their inner authority in favour of an external one: the parent, the teacher, the priest, the doctor, the policeman, etc. Moreover, they absorb a huge part of their parents' own psychological state and disposition. A tool that would otherwise be of immense value to accelerate psychological readiness in regard to the organic environment is then turned into its exact opposite, a vehicle for more quickly carrying over previous intergenerational worldview structures within the child's mind. As the child grows, they form their own mind characters over time, and as it is taught to disregard the inner authority of the ego over an external collective, they quickly become another cog in the wheel of a false world. One could even metaphorically say, and accurately too, that the child's mind character becomes another cog fit into the wheel of samsara, the Hindu-Buddhist term depicting the cycle of birth, suffering, and death that human souls are bound to by ignorance, helping it to keep turning. Next, the mind characters. Mind characters are personality masks that, in a healthy psyche, emerge from the ego as programs to deal appropriately with detected external contexts. Healthily, this detection would be done by the ego as input is received from the external world. A mind character that is in use, that is in active contact with the external world, will be brought to the front of the mind, what I call the front stage. This is the area closest to the external world, and therefore the frontier where interaction first occurs. Should an external context change, the ego may find that the mind character currently in focus is no longer appropriate and will update it with new directives coming from the essential self. The process then is the generation of a new mind character, updated, in the backstage of the psyche, and the replacement of the one in focus with the new required one. The backstage, although still in the subconscious, is inaccessible to the mind character in focus. A good metaphor would be a computer system in which one program that is running does not know of the existence of other programs not currently active in the same system, unless it is specifically programmed to do so. The mind characters is therefore naturally focused, with a far more limited perception capability than the ego. This is because its function is task and objective oriented, in contrast with the fuller existence of the ego. The mind character, in its entirely healthy form, can therefore be metaphorically compared to an AI program running in the front stage of the mind, set there to complete tasks within the context of the organic external world and to interact with the environment and the others. In a healthy psyche, it receives prompts and updates or replacement from the user or ego, never through the use of language, but by a direct individual knowing or certainty. If the connection to the ego is severed, however, shadows of unfiltered, rejected material can be projected onto the world as perception and be rebounded back, eventually, as reflected shadows that stand in as a substitute ego, which I will touch upon further on. Also, given that this disconnection causes a vacuum in the mind's process, the mind character has to compensate by starting to take external prompts from the identified collective authority figures by forming representatives of them in the backstage. For instance, let us imagine that one individual has muffled connection to his own ego and goes into a cult or a religion. Then, as he sits there listening to the cult leader, a representation of that cult leader's idea and visible personality starts to form as an extra mind character in the backstage, entirely external. Then, even in the absence of the actual leader in person, the individual's mind character can act as if the leader was always in his presence, being guided or prompted by that representative in the mind. Much of what has been condemned as the ego by religions, New Age doctrines, and even academic psychology is, in truth, a description of an unhealthy mind character, particularly one in conflict with a shadow. A rare dysfunction named multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, will show the presence of more than one mind character at the front stage simultaneously, but these personalities seemingly have no awareness of the others. Curiously, in the Wikipedia page related to DID, or dissociative identity disorder, it is stated, quote, "The diagnosis is controversial and remains disputed. Proponents of DID, or DID, dissociative identity disorder, support the trauma model, viewing the disorder as an organic response to severe childhood trauma. Critics of the trauma model support the sociogenic or fantasy model of DID as a societal construct and learned behaviour used to express distress, developed through iatrogenesis, or iatrogenesis is harm by medical activity, in therapy, cultural beliefs and exposure to behaviour, in media or online," unquote. This is interesting and relevant because if two or more personalities emerge as a result of iatrogenesis in therapy, cultural beliefs and exposure to the behaviour in media or online, that would imply that medical practice, culture and exposure to media, that is, exposure to the collective false worldview, caused the dysfunction. Although I can see how trauma could cause it, I'm far more inclined to the second possibility, given what can be observed in terms of the collective's worldview and trends on an individual psyche that has been made vulnerable and fragile, especially and particularly with the ego absent. The ego is, after all, the key component of the psyche, the legitimate authority, the truth filter and decision centre, as I presented earlier. It is also, therefore, the volitional centre, the source of will. Will here is defined not as mere desire, but as an internal individual decision put into action. I often remark, desire is the language of thought, but action is the language of will. The ego's individuality, given that it is continuously connected to the essence, is completely independent from the collective, and it is, as I observe, incorruptible. Therefore, if forming mind characters are encouraged from early on to disconnect or ignore their inner individual egos, it follows that they will then develop a fragility that makes them open to external ego surrogates or authority figures that pose as the internal ego. This is actually what Freud identified as the superego, but what I call a projected shadow. I'll address that later on. In any case, multiple personality disorder, or DID, dissociative identity disorder, is very rare, and the rule is that one personality occupies the front stage area of an individual psyche, being updated from the backstage whenever necessary, but never dissociating with the memories and the identity of the psyche itself. The backstage is extremely important for worldview insertion because that is where a stand-in, a psychological representative of the false worldview, will be placed to update the mind character and focus on the front stage in the absence of the connection to the individual's ego. This has, in my view, been the cause of any demonic possession cases recorded. Setting aside any verifiable frauds, those who are legitimately convinced they are possessed by a demon or an alien or a spirit have these following aspects in common. 1. Demons, aliens, or spirits have a significant presence in the worldview of the collective these individuals find themselves in. After all, demonic possession is far more prevalent in highly religious communities than in others. Aliens arrived as a later definition for demons or angels, offering a similar concept to atheists. It is also more prevalent among believers, but not exclusively. Mere contact with the concept is sufficient. 2. It is far more prevalent in individuals who have suffered severe psychological trauma. 3. It is also more prevalent in individuals who do not see themselves as having any notable important status in their communities or the collective in general. 4. All individuals must necessarily have a dormant connection between the mind character on the front stage and the organic ego in the throne room, in the model I present. Demonic, alien, or spirit possession is therefore linked to a representative of a given worldview being lodged in the backstage of the mind, performing an extreme delusion recognizable by the culture. This also includes psychosomatically induced symptoms. One different and more common manifestation of demon possession with psychosomatic symptoms is seen in a hypochondriac. For instance, the individual has contact with the notion of several diseases from the collective setting of the worldview, media, or formal religion, and can believe himself to be possessed by such illnesses. A good example is germophobia, a condition under which the subject treats germs in the same way as demons, due to the correlation between germ theory and older forms of demonic possession beliefs. We saw a lot of this back in 2020. Germophobia is one of the scientific forms of demon possession, produced for atheists and for those more prone to follow scientism than any other formal religion. In a variety of different ways, this type of phenomenon can manifest as a culture-bound syndrome too. These are diseases induced by shared cultural beliefs that may or may not include self-inflicted, psychosomatic, physical effects. Also from its Wikipedia page, the following parameters are defined. 1. Categorization as a disease in the culture, i.e. not a voluntary behaviour or false claim. 2. Widespread familiarity in the culture. 3. Complete lack of familiarity or misunderstanding of the condition to people in other cultures. 4. No objectively demonstrable biochemical or tissue abnormalities or signs. 5. Recognition and treatment by the folk medicine of the culture. From these parameters, we can observe that the condition in question must be well known, identifiable, and categorized within the shared culture or false worldview exclusively. It also must have no correlation to any actual biological dysfunction and, most importantly, must have an available treatment thoroughly set up by the collective. This is why demons or virus possession is a recognized and expected malady that has the exorcising priest or the doctor as the available provider of the remedy. It is a condition that is self-induced by the mind character, bereft of the connection with the organic and legitimate individual ego, to fit in and offer confirmation or reality to the expectations of the external collective authority model or false worldview, thus being given acceptance of membership. There are also cases in which a condition with a biological cause is interpreted within a culture as a supernatural event, in the same manner as a culture-bound syndrome, possession or abduction by aliens, even among non-formally religious and atheist people, still bear the same similarities. The abduction scenario is expected and has a well-catalogued lore surrounding it, and the community of supposed ufologists are ready to offer support and an acceptance into a community setting. Basically, without any prior knowledge of a scenario or condition, the mind character cannot generate any self-induced expected symptoms, because there is no prior memory of them. This is because the condition is not externally caused, but internally induced by the mind character. This is the same reason why in NDEs or near-death experiences, a subject does not see anything that there is no previous concept of. Using two mere examples, there are countless NDE stories about people seeing dead relatives, and also of people converting to a religion despite having been an atheist and even confrontational towards religion leading up to that point. The dead relative result is thoroughly expected in culture due to multiple media insertions over generations, while the conversion scenario occurs to individuals with knowledge of that religion, despite their belief or opposing stance. The opposition to something implies at least partial knowledge or an image of that something. I dare claim all such experiences reveal content that had previously been introduced by any of the multiple sources we are exposed to in the modern world due to mass media. Therefore, in a remote setting, one with low media interference, these experiences will be limited to the available locally shared cultural pool. Another aspect, far lighter in manifestation, is the possession by culture itself, that is, by that representative of the culture in the backstage, like I stated, that very superego that Freud defined. In these cases, the deference of the mind character goes entirely to the collective within the mind, because the character does not want to be seen as an outcast externally. This also implies a disconnection with the organic ego, as that always causes a feeling of abandonment in the mind character, thus making it fragile. It paralyzes individual initiative, because there is no basis or generator for it, which is one of the functions of the ego, and it also halts individual contemplation and analysis. So, the only compensatory measure found by the mind character, left alone to contend with a complex world it is not equipped to understand and navigate, is to entirely follow the rules of the collective's slice it was given, in the hope that it will keep him safe, that is, within a comfortable degree of predictability. In such cases, the person follows every wind-up turn of the collective, even gaslighting himself just to maintain a place within the community setting. This is, of course, a trait shared by narcissists, which often causes confusion in defining the condition. A narcissist has, for whatever reason, no connection whatsoever to the guidance of the ego, not even a glimpse, and thus has nowhere to fall back to internally, no foundation at all, merely a void. Consequently, the collective and its external validation become the only source of existence for the narcissist. So, being directed by the collective's representative is a much milder manifestation and not comparable to being solely existent in it, such as in the extreme case of a full-blown narcissist. Note also that this collective false worldview, represented in the mind, is a shadow that arose from the rejection of an ego connection. In the Christian metaphor, this is the act of betraying Christ, the turning away from the inner mediator of truth. In doing so, one falls under the dominion of the devil, that is, of projection and delusion, until salvation arrives through repentance, which is nothing more than the restoration of that broken link. To repent, in this sense, is to return inward, to realign with the ego, and to reintegrate or exorcise the shadows that arose from separation. Such a collective shadow is equivalent to what are, in the mystical circles, called egregores. These are not, however, in my opinion, sentient, but merely shared programming, material, however, forming a field of emotional conversion between individuals. A mild example of an egregor's pull can be felt in any collective gathering event, for instance, a sports game. The collective emotional field is fed by and influences all the individuals, pulling the desire for a certain team to win, for example. That almost magnetic influence of emotional peer pressure is not always so evident, and the attraction to collectively shared desires can be felt even in the absence of a physical gathering, if the programming for it has already been established in the mind character. Egregores are not, in my view, supernatural at all, but a result of a shared shadow projection and, when used purposefully, a psychological technology. Ultimately, an aspect that is key to understand is that if a mind character is led to cut off with his ego, he will be then sharing the same need for predictability as the worldview writers, only from the opposite side of the power relationship. In a very literal way, that mind character is converted into a co-writer because he will add gladly to the false perception stories following the given directives and fill in gaps that may eventually emerge in the narratives within it. See now how the make your own reality idea is also a part of this. It turns individuals into co-writers of the false worldview under specific, limiting directives. Next, the shadow. Projection onto the external is a naturally healthy process of the psyche. The ego prompts the mind character to project onto the world the individuality it is manifesting, thus receiving an appropriate reflection, result, or answer. A mind character can ask a question it has been having trouble with and, if the connection is established, receive a response from the ego. These responses or reflections are a feedback from the external, applied onto the internal perception. The mind character, metaphorically, projects out the question, or matter at hand, and the ego then picks up and discerns the echo of its answer. Usually this is a synchronistic event, always individual in nature, because nobody else can share that very same psyche. This process is due to the fact that, in psychological perception, the organic world is always a mirror of the internal process. The world itself is organic and unexpected, as previously addressed. However, each internal psyche is subjective, being entirely individual in nature. The ego can therefore obtain individually relevant meaning from the observation of reality, as it echoes and mirrors the projections. There is a link, therefore, between individual and world, between subjective and objective, that is key to the experience of manifested life. However, this organic process can be collectively hoaxed. This can be done, for example, by a mentalist. He will first synchronize the mind characters of an audience to a narrow framework of possibilities, an introduction of a scenario, thus synchronizing each subjective, individual psyche onto a narrowed, objective mental image. Then, he prompts that audience to all ask the same question or have the same expectation, which is even more effective if they consider the question or expectation arose organically and not as an external prompt. Finally, the mentalist will present an answer that resembles a synchronicity to the audience, given they were all sharing the same narrowed thought stream and questions for which he provided the answer. This is, once more, another organic process mimicked to legitimize authority and assign higher powers to the mentalist. One can easily infer how this can also be done by a social power structure, especially with the use of mass media. Nowadays, most people are led to watch more or less the same movies, series, or other entertainment, as well as news reports. Despite the offer pool being vast, trends in targeted marketing direct the attention of the collective by groups and subgroups towards certain equivalent content. This is the narrowing of the scope of possibilities, on one hand, while also presenting possibilities to the audience that may have not organically ever occurred. Pre-programming, in other words. Then, in the content, there will always be subliminal prompts that bring up specific questions or subjects to the mind characters watching it. People watching think they are coming up with these questions and subjects when actually they were prompted by the very content they watched. This increases the illusion's hold. Then, finally, an incident occurs in the false worldview, a staged performance that links back to both the narrowed field of presented possibilities, but also the questions and subjects that were prompted from the content. That result causes acceptance as reality in the majority and a collective synchronistic awe to a part of the minority that is a bit more attentive to the details. The latter group then may consider that the event was prophesied or somehow predicted by the content, or that the world is a simulation run by supernatural demons or angels, when the observation of the hoax was in fact pre-programmed to be treated as organic and hence magical. This is what I call weaponized apophenia. All such occurrences involve staged events and hoaxes, just like the mentalist performance outlined earlier. We will look into this hoaxing later on. It is also actually partially similar to the Mandela effect, in my opinion, as a prompted false memory created and emerged from a narrowed field of possibilities. Having established the process of organic individual projection and reflection, and also having looked at an example of a method to coax it into a collective worldview, let us now explore the shadow as a result of rejection, not from the perspective of academic psychology, but from my own contemplation. When the ego, again, the legitimate individual decision centre, prompts the mind character and focus toward an action, and that task is, for some reason, declined or ignored, a rejection occurs within the mind. Note that here we are not talking about the desires of the mind character, but an organic will from the ego as the essential authority. The rejection of the organic, which usually occurs due to an external collective peer pressure, whose worldview considers the individual will unacceptable, can, over time, if left unresolved, generate a shadow projection. This is an artificial construct of a perceived self-image and desire that are not in accordance with the organic will of the actual ego. This is the formula regarding the urban polity, how it expands. This is what I call distance from nature, or the ego in this sense, plus proximity to simulated living, or the false worldview, or false mind character, equals severance from authenticity. That rejection of the organic, which usually occurs due to an external, collective peer pressure whose worldview considers the individual will unacceptable, can, over time, if left unresolved, generate a shadow projection. This is an artificial construct of a perceived self-image and desire that are not in accordance with the organic will of the ego. This means that the same process defined before of the organic ego prompting the mind character to project a question or an action onto the external organic world is now, instead, led by a shadow surrogate, created by external influence. For example, imagine someone working at a job that does not match their vocation, or that has already run the extent of its utility for that particular individual. The ego may realise this and prompt the mind character to quit the job. The mind character, instead of going ahead and leaving, starts analysing the implications of that action, perhaps gathering input from others, and eventually decides to stay, motivated by fear of the unknown beyond the predictability of that job. The mind character is a focused, task-oriented intelligence, so it cannot perceive as much as the ego, which is the actual individuality, the I. The ego has already taken into account the ramifications of that action and knows that For example, a better job or a more appropriate life situation lies ahead. The mind character cannot see this and, motivated by the tension of the possible loss reflected back at him from the external, decides to ignore the impulse. From then on, if the rejection of legitimate individuality is maintained, a shadow eventually emerges as a partial substitute for the ego's guidance. Following that shadow's directives, whose intention is merely to maintain the status quo, in the particular example we're analysing, this mind character will go deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole of the collective worldview, possibly even losing sight altogether of the original organic ego. It is both a metaphorical and psychological sense. The mind character descends into hell. Circumstances around him seem to conspire against that shadow directive and always find a way to disrupt the initial intention of staying under the security of the collective's propriety. Shielded from a possible fate perceived by the mind character is worse than the sacrifice of the organic self. This negative feedback is due to the reflection of that very shadow onto the external world, which here acts as a perception mirror. In similar fashion that it mirrors organic responses to genuine ego queries, just as it mirrors artificial responses to the counterfeit desires of the projected shadow. These two types of shadow, projected and reflected, then enter into conflict within the psyche. This conflict is important because it should organically signal to the mind character that the choice was not in accordance with the individual's ego and essence, and lead it to reconsider. It also accounts for the observation that the more one stands upon a false belief, the more the characteristics of that false belief seem to be perceived in the external world, a result of projection, reflection, and the ensuing conflict between the two. However, the collective worldview has taken this into account and provides safeguards in the form of appeasements which, although ultimately self-harming, reduce the short-term stress caused by such conflict. These appeasers may include entertainment, hobbies, or ritual practices, or may take the form of actual chemical anesthesia for the symptoms, drugs. We may observe a myriad of things to do, placed there with the intention of keeping individual minds occupied and away from any ongoing internal conflict. Should enough time be allowed for contemplation of the conflict itself, the ego might re-emerge, something undesirable for the worldview keepers. These distractions act as a valve, easing tension but never resolving the underlying issue, and can be prolonged indefinitely throughout an individual's lifespan. In cases where the individual finds no appeasement within the vast spectrum offered by the collective, far more socially harmful habits may emerge. In such cases, the worldview has a functioning judicial system designed to temporarily remove that individual from the collective, with imprisonment, for example, such as the dual form assumed by the worldview, the crook and the flail, the shield and the sword, or the jester and the warden. An important aspect to understand here is the psychological effect of punishment upon one such mind character. After all, how many people have come out of prison converted to a formal religion, or at least to an acceptable branch of the false worldview? Not all, of course, but a number significant enough to warrant attention. In any case, the mind character's switched identification towards an external representative, or projected shadow, becomes intertwined with its foundational existence. The mind character metaphorically links up all aspects of his sentience to that perceived authority. Therefore, the maintenance of the corresponding worldview becomes linked with the maintenance of the perceived self, even though it is not the actual source of organic individuality. Consequently, any doubts cast over the worldview will be seen as attacks on the very self. Any disturbance to the virtual reality of perception will be treated as an existential threat. This is why any false worldview has to be continuously reinforced by daily confirmation and cyclic ritual. A lie needs to be maintained by constant reinforcement, but the truth is self-evident and needs no attention to exist. So the ego remains there in the background, ignored for years, but can be returned at any such time. As the mind character wishes it, by letting go of the grasp of the external representative. Such a decision implies a degree of psychological death, as the character's existence had become linked with the worldview it held, which is a frightening prospect to contemplate. If that leap is taken, however, and the connection with the organic ego is re-established, then the mind character will be reborn anew, this time regulated from the legitimate organic authority of the psyche. Once again, using the gospel as a metaphorical reference, the mind character has to be born again. Nicodemus came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these things that you do unless God is with him." Jesus answered him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Nicodemus said to him, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born?" Jesus answered, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with every one who is born of the Spirit." John 3, verses 2 to 8. In this setting, born of the flesh is born of the worldview, while born of the Spirit is born of the legitimate individuality, the ego, or, as stated previously, the way to the essence. Many years ago, I think it must have been 2007 or so, I was sitting down in meditation with burning questions in my mind. Who truly am I? What is this world? I had traversed a Buddhist journey that did not lead me to satisfactory answers, and with a certain sense of final attempt, I decided to meditate on these very questions, hoping such answers would emerge. Looking back, I now see that, at the time, my mind character was projecting the very wish to reconnect to my organic ego. So, I sat and began focusing on the breath, as was usual, sitting quietly and motionlessly. After a while, I began hearing a whisper in my mind, suggesting move. I did not move and kept focusing on the breath, sitting still as before. The voice kept increasing its intensity, telling me louder and louder, and from a more pleasant tone to a more commanding one, move. As determined as I was to obtain the answer to those questions, I knew that moving would interrupt that meditation and consequently distract me from whatever the process would lead me to. I somehow understood that this voice was in me, but had been externally inserted, and that if I obeyed and moved, it would retain control. I continued to sit still and focus on the breathing. Eventually, the escalation increased dramatically, and the voice was now yelling in my mind, move. It started causing itches, prompting me to move to scratch them, and triggering impulses for any motion of the body. I had meditated many times before, and never had this intense conflict, almost a desperation, a merge. Sitting still there, focused on my breathing, I knew that this was part of my answer. It was part of the reflection of the intention I had projected as I went to meditate that time. It was not a mere desire, but a deep organic will to know. The pressure had grown to what would, in other circumstances, be terrifying levels. There were threats in that voice. You will die. Move. You will go insane. Move. Yet none of the pressure moved me. I remained still and focused on the breathing, witnessing the despair of that voice that had been brought to the fore, what I now identify as the front stage. After a long struggle, I really can't say how long, the voice yelled one last desperate time, "Move," and faded away suddenly, leaving a serene silence behind. From deeper within the psyche, a sensation of relief emerged, a sense of homecoming, a welcoming warmth, a shivering delight that ran through my body and my mind. When I finally ended that meditation, I was certain of one thing. I had reconnected to an organic part of myself. Nowadays I identify as the organic ego, and it would start me on a new journey that would not only tell me who I am, but also what the world is. Here I am now, in 2025, writing this book about what the psyche and the world are, after a long journey since then that forced me to let go of previous attachments and false mind characters. From then on, I was gradually led by this organic compass to first let go of the world's hold on my mind characters so that I could observe it from outside and, in the process, know who I truly am. This journey is not complete yet. It has brought me far enough to contribute, through my own organic individual vocation, to the likewise journey of any who may find themselves in a similar conundrum. I do not have expectations about it, but keep alive that very will that initiated the process back then. In what concerns the subject of this chapter, what happened was that I then let go of the hold the projected shadow had on my mind character. Does this mean it completely disappeared? No, it did not. But it never again held me back from the organic connection I had re-established. My guide changed, and the more I followed my individuality, the less power the shadow held. Until, in 2023, in one dire stretch of humiliation, my mind character was placed face to face with it, understood its origins, its individual intricacies, and, by understanding my own responsibility in the matter of its growth and maintenance, I let it go. From that moment, all my life fell into place, to have a chance to be my organic self. My account of how it happened for me is not the rule, nor is it the only way for such reconnection to occur. Being born of rejection, that is, projected, and then reflected back, the more that feedback conflict intensifies, of the projected material being bounced back at it, the more the shadow grows. This implies that there are moments when the built-up energy becomes so intense that it can no longer be contained and metaphorically explodes. Hopefully, a mind character can re-establish that organic connection without having to reach such a dramatic point. However, if no reconnection attempts are tried, if the appeasers put in place are not effective, and if the build-up becomes too extreme, the pressure in the psyche will reach a critical point and a shadow explosion may occur. This is characterized by a complete disruption of the mind character's foundation, a moment of irrevocable and inescapable defeat, and an obliteration of the internal representative by a full-blown revealed shadow. This is what I call a tower moment related to the 16th major arcana of the tarot of the same name, one where the entire structure of that psyche is taken down by an instant zap. This exploding moment provides a chance to reconnect to the ego, as the surrogate guide has then just been destroyed and taken over by a complete and overgrown reflected shadow. It can also, however, entirely shatter the mind if the mind character is unable to bring itself to control, cowered under the weight of such an extreme pressure. I've asked my friend Rìgh, who had been a guest on my Prognosis podcast before, for a suitable metaphor in engineering. He conveyed to me the rubber band effect and regenerative braking. In physics, the rubber band experiment demonstrates thermodynamic principles, showing that a rubber band cools when released after being stretched due to a decrease in entropy and a spontaneous process that lowers temperature. This effect is explained using the Helmholtz free energy equation, where the change in free energy depends on tension and temperature. In a very literal sense, it shows nature's intrinsic and ordered tendency towards balance that I presented earlier. Regenerative braking is the concept of storing the energy produced by the action of stepping on the brakes in any land-based vehicle. It can be stored in one of three ways: in hybrid motors, chemically in a battery, in a bank of capacitors, or mechanically in a rotating flywheel. Hydraulic systems use hydraulic motors to store energy in the form of compressed air. These can all be conceptualized as a rubber band being stretched to its maximum point, releasing when actuated at the required time when necessary. The gas and steam engine's initial generative motion, produced and self-sustaining indefinitely with the initial action in regenerative braking, would be equivalent to the acceleration pedal. With these principles in mind, we can draw a metaphor regarding the shadow projection and reflection self-feeding mechanism, which was started by an initial rejection. The initial rejection equivalent to the initial generative motion produced by stepping on the acceleration pedal produces the shadow. That shadow is then projected externally, equivalent to the vehicle moving in reality, propelled by the inertia of that initial impulse. Inevitably, a conflicting force is met, a friction that is reflected back, for example, in the form of an obstacle on the road. The vehicle is forced to brake and slow down, or stop its motion. By doing so, its regenerative braking system stores more energy in itself. The opposing reflected force from the external that confronts the opposing reflected force from the external that confronts the projected shadow is the reflection of the shadow itself, given that, in nature, any force is subject to an inherent counterforce. The energy stored by the conflict with the obstacle reflected back feeds more energy to that shadow. This is why, usually, when an individual under the influence of a shadow is confronted by conflict, he tends to double down on his position and worldview. The conflict feeds the shadow and consequently feeds the worldview it is dependent on. So imagine that the more energy is stored by braking at each obstacle, the more the shadow accelerates afterwards. This then turns into a self-feeding cycle where the more the vehicle accelerates, the harder it will have to brake at the obstacle, thus building up more energy than it spends. Eventually, just as the rubber band effect, there will come a point where the maximum capacity for energy storage is reached and the integrity of the machine is compromised. Likewise, a psyche can only hold so much shadow before a breaking point occurs. Again, note how what made it build up energy, like a rubber band or spring pulled back further and further, was the conflict with the feedback reflected back at the shadow itself in the individual psyche. Once the limit is reached and passed, the rubber band can't be held anymore, and it either snaps, the psyche breaks down, or it violently releases all its stored energy in one single violent swoop. The false self-image or false identity of the mind character is defeated. If the psyche breaks down, sheer dysfunction can set in, taking varied forms. If the explosion is the result, by the effect of projection and self-reflection of the shadow, then the consequence is a mind character left with no way out, yet with a unique chance to let go of the shadow surrogate altogether and to accept the healthy individual aspect that initially was rejected, reconnecting to his legitimate ego. In popular parlance, this is the often heard, "You have hit rock bottom before coming back up." As can be seen, the generation of a shadow initiates a process that dictates its own demise by the very reflection of its own energy. This demise can destroy the psyche with it, but it can also bring it back closer to the healthy point of balance that is natural to it. Metaphorically, the self-feeding machine is destroyed, but the driver can then walk on his own two organic legs. The world replaced the world. Previously, I had presented consideration on what the world could actually mean, when not corresponding to the physical reality itself. Doing so, I used the Christian New Testament depiction of it, while comparing it not only with Buddhism, but also with Christian Gnosticism. Whether I was satisfactory or not to you, the reader, in my assertion that this world definition could not really mean physicality itself, that is a point I not only maintain, but intend to ponder upon. I wish to consider the consequences and, as I do so, speculate on possible scenarios that would logically develop from them. If you wish to continue following my contemplation on these matters, keep in mind that from my perspective, as I described, a shadow is a composition of rejected, healthy natural aspects that grow increasingly more deviant, twisted and grotesque the more it is kept away from its natural place by that very initial rejection due to the feedback of reflection from the external onto the artificial shadow itself. The shadow is projected by a mind character cleft off from the connection to its own organic and legitimate ego as a surrogate guide to its perception. That projection is then conflicted with the feedback received back from the external. The ego never leaves, but is shut away from the direct contact with its mind characters until such a time as they, led past a certain threshold of internal conflict, seek to re-establish that contact. Such an eventuality is not produced by successfully defeating the shadow surrogate via the conflict itself, because as seen before in Reagan's example, the conflict feeds itself, the shadow growth, but instead by its integration back to the natural healthy place it originally was rejected from. Internal conflict at the psychological level results in the same type of consequence one would expect from trying to fight a fire using wooden weapons. The wood would itself be ignited, and the fire would spread further instead of subsiding. This metaphor attempts to convey how the unresolved shadow, when put under conflict by opposing mind characters, uses their very weapons to further spread itself. I have also stated, but will reiterate that point, that the ultimate motivation of a shadow is to regain what it lost, that is, to be reintegrated into the health from whence it was cast out of. If this objective is not accomplished by the initial mild warnings, then it may need to be brought about much later on by a chaotic, desperate defeat of the false self-image of the mind character, when the shadow grew beyond the limit and exploded. Remember that I postulated the existence of two types of shadows. One that is the projection of a surrogate ego, produced by the affected mind character to replace the internal guide. The other that is a reflection of the initial shadow onto the psyche, that conspires to confront its image. If one, such as I do, sees the symbolism, the metaphor, and not the literal, it becomes easy to find this most prominent of themes virtually everywhere. Granted, these themes are often skewed and treated with adulteration, but their core remains, as forgeries need to resemble an original, if they are to be successful ruses. In Christianity, Christ emerges as the authority in the story, redeeming the people from their sins. What sins are those? They all relate to either addiction or rejection, in one way or another, therefore, all relating to a submersion into psychological artificiality, with inevitable consequent physical effects along the way. That is, nevertheless, entirely perceptual in nature. I have used gluttony before as an example of such processes. Attention regarding a lack leads to a rejection of the possibility of such lack, which leads to overcompensating for it, consequently leading to attempting to ensure the lack occurs as little as possible or never. The process used by the mind character to keep this lack at bay is that of scripting itself, the environment and others around it, making existence predictable, albeit artificial. What perhaps starts off as a simple, harmless agreement grows, due to the artificial rejection behind its motivations, into an entire virtual reality of perception. A scripted, perceived world, basically a live-action role-playing game, is imposed upon the organic one and covers it like a veil. That, I contend, is the exact same veil equivalent to world in Christianity, depicted by Buddhism in Gautama Buddha, a symbolic equivalent to Christ, for he is there as the teacher that redeems those stuck in the veil of illusion and ignorance. An interesting and perhaps anecdotal side note, Siddhartha Gautama was portrayed as being the son of a king, King Suddhodana, which establishes this character with authoritative legitimacy for peoples whose worldview required caste and lineage to be seen as possible bearers of such traits. Furthermore, his mother is written as having been named Maya, which is curiously also the name of the Hindu demon that created the veil of illusions where man is entrapped. Interestingly too, is that Maya, Siddhartha's mother, is written to have died shortly after giving birth to him, signifying narratively that Maya would die shortly after the arrival of the redeeming teacher. In this example, we see how the writers of the myth included in it narrative elements that seek to establish contact with organic elements, along with certain people's collective world perceptions, in order for the story to be accepted into the psyche's memory room. The fact is that these points of recognised meaning have to be included to trigger acceptance in accordance with the world they are addressing. Curiously, it uses pre-established worldview points that are seen as true to introduce new narratives that build upon them. However, not all such newer narratives may have had ill intent. It is common in psychology, the proper kind, I dare say, to follow the delusional perspective of the patient to then reach the root of his issues. If to correct a delusion, all it took was a correction of perception by proving facts and exposing hoaxes, a mere conversation might do the trick. That is not the case, however, because the ego is cut off and being represented by that initial projected replacement shadow. With this, I am not defending or upholding trickery for good causes, but merely stating that the delusional state in which mankind finds itself in, generally, may actually call upon such tools to attempt to remedy it. As I presented previously, a shadow repurposes the weapons used against it in conflict as tools for its benefit. This is observable, in my view, for both types of shadow: the initial projection that tries to maintain the false world perception, and the consequent reflection that attempts to bring it down and to be restored by defeating the self-image of the mind character. At a point in the world when, collectively, we see the growing dominance of an ideology that promotes the perception of physicality as illusory and undesirable, we find fertile ground for the spread of ideas such as euthanasia, antinatalism, doomsday cults, nature correction, and various forms of spiritual or technological simulationism. The latter is invariably tied to the misconception of mistaking the world born out of collective misperception for the organic world. The perceiving mind character judges the world through its own imposed belief lenses and rejects its actuality, thus becoming open to the notion that it is neither a mere illusion or an artificial simulation from which it will one day awaken, or to which it will remain forever bound, depending on the belief currently in vogue within the individual's memory room. Regardless, simulationism in any form represents an extreme modern manifestation of this confusion between the perceived world and the organic world. This transpires also in the question of predestination and free will, where I can recognise the difference between script and improvisation, between predictable and unpredictable, in the former and latter, respectively. My own view does not choose necessarily between them, seeing as only a balance can bring health to that matter. After all, the organic world has some predictability to it. The sun rises at every dawn and sets at every dusk, for instance. However, it also implies unpredictable elements that require and imply improvisation. Regardless of how much man has built these virtual realities of perception and ritualized life artificially, the unpredictability still shines through from time to time. It is an unremitting struggle to maintain the world as a cohesive narrative and, at the same time, update its story, its blueprint, to even more predictable ones. And so we see the rise, who knows how long ago, of event hoaxing and history writing. These will be addressed in the following chapter, but it seems to me important to call the reader's attention to the importance of a new type of emerging virtual reality, with which this world of false perception and predictability will be reinforced. We are coming to a point where it will be almost impossible, by the senses alone, to distinguish an AI-rendered video from actual footage. Before, visual illusions required physicality. Now, and since the invention and mass distribution of visual media devices such as TV, it has become exponentially more difficult to tell apart world of false perception, built on previously inserted false memories and beliefs, from the organic world. Before, you needed books, agreements, blood oaths, rewards, and enforcement to update and maintain an agreed-upon delusion. Now, and increasingly so, a completely fabricated, computer-generated clip can be worth 1,000 such precautions. Yet keep in mind that as much as the projected shadow's false perception of the world grows, so does its reflected counterpart, as it would in a mirror. Let us take a look at, in practical terms and with a dramatic example, how that false perception can spread, made to be perceived as real, and how it can affect human life. Chapter 5. Event Hoaxing and History Writing. Given all that was presented earlier, it is now time to look at a key component in the fabrication and maintenance of these worlds, or worldviews that are perceptually superimposed onto the organic world. These are entirely human in origin, and also in application, although, of course, they affect all organic life, directly or indirectly, due to human interaction. History is the collective equivalent of the memory room in the individual psyche. It should record, after analysis by the legitimate and trustworthy authority, the facts and events that took place, to provide a pool of knowledge and past experiences to draw from as life is lived. However, history is not consensual. Even among official historians, divergence about the actual occurrence of an event, its motivations and context, show that something is not genuine or trustworthy about the records taken. A victorious faction will often, for instance, alter the narrative and record it to ensure its own worldview takes precedence over any others. In fact, the historical record is so clouded that countless inferences can be taken from any period to build a narrative that best suits the observer's worldview. For example, one embodying liberalism will look upon the dissolution of previously held social standards as a sign of progress, while one embodying conservatism will view it as a destructive attack and a loss. The narratives of history are, therefore, entirely subjective to begin with. Then there may also be the projection of a previously held worldview onto a particular piece of evidence, shaping it to appear real. In the same way, a believer can look upon the Shroud of Turin and see his faith validated, thus selecting a particular object that confirms the internal world. One can look upon a narrative point in history and read it according to the same biased filter. I postulate that historians, therefore, although they should act as the filter of truth, similar to an individual's ego before storing content into the memory room, act as shadow representatives of the worldview that placed them in such a position. We also observe that once a historian doubts the consensus he was supposed to reinforce and validate, he enters a process of ostracization that has nothing to do with his intrinsic contribution, but with his diverging views. In that respect, it is the same with any field of scientism, of which history is a part of. Therefore, history is subject to the same religious framework found in scientism that was discussed before, and is consequently neither science nor objective. Concurrent with the subjectivity of history is the bias of belief as stated. Belief in the source, belief in the context, belief in the recorded narrative, all because history is an exercise of belief, given that it implies trust in not only the filters, the historians, but also in the validity and authenticity of the evidence and given sources. You might ask, what relevance does this have to the subject matter of this work? How does this relate to the structure of man's psyche? It is extremely relevant, key even, because the false worldviews, as presented earlier, mimic collectively that very individual structure to cause identification. In a sense, by history mimicking the organic and individual memory room, with historians filtering and validating as the organic ego would, it is creating a collective corporation, which is an imitation of life, a Frankenstein's monster, imbued with the false sentience that each individual helps to feed, a golem, in other words. Its body parts are made up of each of the individual members of society involved in it, performing as differentiated functions as actual body parts would. To know and understand the psyche, it is therefore imperative to also know how it has been deviated by mimicry. Two authors who seem to have been heavily involved in the worldview fabrication process have brought to the fore two complementary models for it. If George Orwell in 1984 presented an active curation, censoring and rewriting of history from the power structure, Aldous Huxley in A Brave New World described it more as a passive process of mass distraction and appeasement. Both, I will affirm, work in tandem, especially in the modern world of our lifetimes. This presence of mass media intensified immensely the capacity for history writing, be it by opinion spreading, be it by offering reality in the individual psyches to any reported event. With mass media, all it took was for a reporter to write an account, perhaps attach a photograph, and it became reality, and consequently, history. There was this idea up until recent decades that photographs can't lie. Of course, the techniques of photography manipulation grew hand in hand with their development. Then the illusions of film production began to show how presenting images that look real but are actually productions and concoctions was not only possible, but profitable. Whole industries were set up around it, developing techniques to make those images seem gradually more real. The line between images that were taken as fiction and those that were taken as real was drawn by exactly the same method as history: validation. Instead of historians, the labelling of real onto images and news reports was done by the reporting agents themselves, Then once validated, those very reports would be incorporated into history by historians, with only an official validation as a requirement. Whenever doubts emerged, again the process of ostracisation via an internal peer review would be initiated to maintain the integrity of the historical narrative. By internal, I do not necessarily mean actively fraudulent peer reviews, but instead that the reviewers are selected according to their adherence to the desired worldview, thus ensuring it is enforced against any dissent. The conflict of interests in reviewing different points of view emerges not necessarily due to the reviewer's rewards being dependent on the result, confirming the desired worldview, which they also are in any case, but by sincere enforcement of that worldview through their reviewing. Suppose a psyche is invested through all the processes described previously in this work in a worldview. In that case, all will be reviewed through such a filter to promote its validity, due to the identification between the mind character and the surrogate external ego authority. In summary, a mix of both methods can be observed in our present day. On the one hand, there is an active development, curation and rewriting of history, such as George Orwell presented. On the other, it is accompanied by an all-encompassing distraction and entertainment that appeases and discourages re-evaluation, as presented by Aldous Huxley. As a link to a supposed concrete past, history is unreliable due to the necessary implied trust in the mediating and validating sources for the narratives presented, which are inevitably linked to irrevocable interests in either a status quo or a new directed social transition. As a record of present and recent times, history is also unreliable because the sources of today's news are linked with the same ones that wrote and rewrote the past. Quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," unquote. That was George Orwell. In fact, the recent news are far more quickly turned into historical fact than ever before, due to the immediacy of mass media. The interval of analysis is gone. The validation period of reviewing is virtually non-existent, although this immediacy is a characteristic inherent to mass media per se. It is also a promoted condition by the very power structure itself, given how communication and computing technology was the one single field of big investment and development, with truly outstanding innovative results in the recent decades. Let us say that this particular worldview, with all its inclusive, multifaceted ramifications, has built itself an overwhelming indoctrinator, enforcer, and reality maker. Mass media was built by the writers of the worldview to serve it, not the other way around. This transition and false perception of the world did not emerge as a result of immediate communication technology. Instead, it was the perception writers themselves that had it built to spread it efficiently. Despite all my presented doubts about the records of past history, that one aspect of it stands out as far more insidious. Mass media writes history instantly. Therefore, if the events recorded have not at all even been scrutinised by time, how are we to trust this history any better? I had earlier presented the hoaxing capabilities of AI imagery, but that does not mean that even before AI, just like photography, events that became history in our times were not produced, crafted, and staged, instead of occurring organically. The presence of hoax indicators listed by Tim Osman of the Infinite Plane Society condenses very well the requirement for individual analysis of the moments that make up history, and that we passively take as facts. We will look at them shortly. Before, however, let us look at a concrete example of both an event hoaxing and history writing, and also one of the most pivotal of our recent history, with worldwide implications: the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2022. After all, This one event demonstrated, once the inconsistencies were seen through, that the worldview knows no national boundaries or supposed governmental jurisdictions to spread its false perceptions. It also showed how all media reporters, regardless of culture, language, and background, sing in absolute unison. The following summary was based upon a record of the timeline of build-up towards and during the 2020 event, found in chironreturn.org /chronology /, put together by Eric Coppolino. Although I personally do not endorse all the views contained in it, it is very comprehensive, and I suggest the reader to download and read for themselves. In 2006, the USA's Department of Homeland Security produced a report titled, quote, "Fear of terrorist attack could trigger mass psychogenic illness," unquote. In it, one can see the foundations of what would later be used as a massively applied worldwide culture-bound syndrome, establishing the connection between fear and self-induced symptoms, just like would be expected from, for instance, and as also presented earlier, demonic possession. The Centre for Disease Control also published a report where the erroneous and unreliable usage of PCR tests as a diagnostic tool proved to cause problematic false alarms regarding pertussis. One of the most important factors revealed is that although virology and epidemiology was relying on PCR tests alone, these proved ineffective and better tools would be needed. The basis of PCR testing, that was already vastly in use and in the public minds as the dreaded HIV test tool, has always been questioned, even by its inventor. Carrie Mullis stated, quote, "With the PCR test, if you can do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body. So that can be thought of as a misuse of logistics to claim that it's meaningful," unquote. An interview at length can be found here. It would be therefore, along with the subsequent increasing introduction of the fear of a virus-based pandemic over the years, the perfect tool to cause the impression of a disease to produce that very mass hysteria of self-induced symptoms found in the given pertussis example. Prior to 2020, 2 major preparatory drills or simulated scenarios were carried out to test the narratives and responses. One was held in 2017, called the SPARS pandemic, and the other was held just prior to the beginning of the historical event in October 2019, named Event 201. Both were conducted by the Johns Hopkins Institute. In both of these, a fictional scenario of a global pandemic was performed to test possible responses and actions to tackle it. It included much of what was later presented as real in the COVID-19 scenario. The above simulations were basically dress rehearsals to provide all the involved with the necessary cues for scripted performative actions, similar to how a religious ritual would encapsulate the psyche of a targeted believer. In the same way, a group of colluded conmen may weave a whole performance around a potential target they want to deceive and manipulate for a set objective. Freemasonic initiation rituals include such group performances played upon an unaware initiate to instill a certain emotional state and psychological vulnerability. The usage of fake customers, called informally Sakura, is prominent in Japanese culture, as store owners try to attract real customers by a performance that draws interest to the store's products. Another example aspect to provide a certain foreshadowing to an event that helps make it real in the mind is the introduction of entertainment content released previously or concurrently to match the reported event. The above simulated scenarios contributed to that, but among other examples is the 7th of November 2019 episode of Explained from Netflix titled The Next Pandemic, where Bill Gates stars as he goes into the risks of such an event occurring soon. This was also shortly followed by another Netflix documentary series called Pandemic: How to Prevent an Outbreak, released on the 22nd of January 2020, with the same foreshadowing themes. This is, of course, known as predictive programming. I know it as social priming. Yet the supposed prophetic prediction goes as far back to at least 1968, when the movie What's So Bad About Feeling Good came out. The movie depicts an epidemic caused by a virus whose symptoms are a feeling of happiness and kindness. In it, characters are depicted as wearing a similar type of face mask as was seen in 2020, as well as full body suits to prevent contracting the disease. Note, also, that feeling of well-being and cooperation is treated as a disease, which correlates to the messaging during the pandemic to avoid social gatherings and interactions with friends and families, social distancing, of course. Those pertaining to past predictions represent pre-programming, as we've stated, while those close to the event date present concurrent programming. These examples, among many others, actually not only play a part in solidifying belief in a reported reality, but also represent a sign that the event itself, when actually presented, is not organically occurring. Prophecy is not a foreknowledge of what will happen, but foreknowledge of what is scripted to be presented. It introduces to the psyche possibilities that would most probably never organically occur to the individual, thus remaining in the memory room, awaiting validation by the ego when confronted with the reality. If the connection between the mind character and the ego is compromised, then that validation may actually never occur, and the memory is treated then as a fact when triggered. Just to mention really quickly, I'm just going to comment upon this. These are my own views, so this is not actually found in Àrmunn's work, but I think it quite pertinent, and so I'm going to discuss this just really quickly. So this relates to what I would know as the ontological affordance space, right? This is what concurrent programming and pre-programming are essentially creating. So this refers to the relational nature of implied space. Simplifying the concept, it refers to the available dimensions of possibility that a system or agent is able to perceive or achieve. And this is the reason for these narrative containment triggers or protocols, the pre-programming, the concurrent programming, which are occurring at all times due to, of course, mass media. So mass media has now permitted the prime worldview of the system, the narrative containment protocol, the standard manipulation vectors, to seep in like a vast multi-tentacled hydra into every facet of society, to every hearth of every home. It essentially has an imperceptible control over every conversation, over every mind. And so through this, we've effectively externalized our own ego and our own will. And so this surrogate psyche, or ego, or even will, that is contained within the system, treats us and conforms our behavior like a marionette puppet to its own desires, its own will, its own interests. So this again narrows what is possible in a given space and its fundamental constraints. For example, the chair, an environmental factor, offers the human agent the potential to sit along its inherent properties, suggesting that sole action. It's not just its inherent properties. It's not necessarily inherent. The properties themselves are perceived by us to suggest certain actions because, of course, We have absorbed a perception of their actions, of how they are used, of their functionality from our earliest formative years, right? We've seen people, for example, open a door to cross to another threshold of a house or a building. We've seen people sit on a chair, right? But all of those things are determined by our pre-programming of it. We have to be exposed to these suggested soul actions and these suggested functionalities of the given ontological affordance space or ontological affordance object. So affordances are the ways in which an agent may interact with his environment and use something. In the context of the standard manipulation vector, SMV for short, or in other words, a behavioural override script, as Àrmunn was talking about, an avenue of infiltrating the mind of the target agent or actor. Firstly, it is the dream being sold in phase 1 of manipulation. What is possible? This sets the imaginative range of possibilities by implied cogniforms spun by the media. And by the way, this doesn't just have to be in terms of language, or be it verbalized or written. As Àrmunn stated, this can also be in the form of symbols, photographs, imagery. By showing them the vast, glorious realm of what they could achieve. This is why AI is so dangerous, and AI-generated imagery, especially movies and films and motion pictures, are so dangerous. Because, again, they're providing for effectively what is Generation Z and Generation Alpha, the younger generations who have been effectively nursed on screen time. So they already have a completely skewed understanding of what is possible naturally speaking. So they have an unnatural view of the world, almost a cartoonish view of the world. And that's been driven and reinforced by social media and, the validation via algorithm and algorithmic clout. So couple that with AI, they are already primed to believe the incredible. They're primed to believe, I don't know, a fake alien invasion, right? The return of Jesus. Who knows, right? Whatever it may be, the most far-fetched thing you could think of. These younger and younger generations, because of their screen time, because they are being nursed and psychologically developed through the medium of the hyper-reality device, which is, the smartphone, the iPad, any video game console, whatever it may be. They are being nursed on this. They're being developed from it. They are children of the void. They're children of the con. So, example, infinite wealth, utopia, enlightenment, saving the West, stopping illegal aliens, Medicare for all, free Palestine, we have to stop climate change, climate action now, or total freedom. Whatever it may be, it provides them the vision of paradise. So by expanding this space of perceived potential, the manipulator hooks the target's desire, allowing the subsequent narrative containment protocol to psychically funnel that large potential down into a single narrow desired function or action. This collapses autonomy and provides the only acceptable narrative or given action via a guided justification inbuilt into the script or blueprint, problem, reaction, solution, essentially. There's a prefigured solution within every problem or within every media-driven and psychological warfare impetus throughout the society, the culture, the milieu itself. In terms of the operational goals of SMVs, again, standard manipulation vectors, we may say that the SMV's goal is to execute a behavioural override script that bypasses critical thought, cognition, as Àrmunn would state, the ego, right? The actual natural essence, to be compatible with that. to trigger immediate loyalty and desire, not logical persuasion. Coupled with this, the entire process hinges on the final stage of epistemic outsourcing. This is where people externalize their ego and their will to the authority figure, who becomes the surrogate ego, the surrogate will, the surrogate essence. So they put all of their faith, if you will, and their hopes and desires into the unnatural edifice of this Tower of Babel of mass media. So this is where the client accepts the phrase, "Trust me, bro, I'm the expert," or charisma as proof, as we may call it, as sufficient verification or validation for proceeding. Notably, the SMV, again, the standard manipulation vector, ultimately does not offer agency, true freedom of choice, as Àrmunn would state it, being naturally aligned with the ego, with the natural ego, with the organic will, the organic essence. It offers a lease on desire, restricting a person's vast potential into the system's preferred pre-packaged action. And this also relates to the 5 requirements for lawful recursion for any system. DNA, civilization, the mind, to endure, it must satisfy 5 structural requirements. We would know this as negentropy, or as homeostasis. Àrmunn stated it as the closed feedback loop, right? The feedback. So this is exactly this, right? It just continues round, right? The fathers of revolutions, who are also the script writers of civilization, maintain these loops, right? It revolves round, it continues round. This is why Kabbalah states that the cosmic structure is the Merkava, which is the chariot. The chariot itself, the tripartite essence of it, the charioteer, which is the control structure, God, the illusionists of the system, the script writers, mass media, whatever it may be. It controls the reins, again, the propaganda, the tools for manipulation of the steeds, the humans, right? And the steeds, they're completely facing forward. They're in constant motion. There's never any peace. This is why civilization is completely informed, it is completely established and perpetuated by a system of permacrisis. You have permanent crises, a structure of permanent crises. You never get a second. You never open the newspaper and see a good story, right? Or a newspaper full of good stories. You will always see front and centre on the front page of the tabloids something to do with death, something that induces fear, something that imposes a crisis mentality upon the individual and, of course, extrapolated out to the collective society itself. So, again, that is how they treat us. The steed has no idea, it can't turn its head. It is just simply chaos in motion, steered chaos in motion, of course, steered by the charioteer. And what is the reason the charioteer steers that? Well, it perpetuates the 2 wheels at either side. It motions them forward vis-a-vis the powerful, yet completely unaware and ignorant steeds that pull the chariot. And of course, as the Kabbalistic tome state and symbolism seems to imply in the semiotic traditions, that these 2 wheels are the sun and the moon, right? But again, we can extrapolate that out to the idea of the Hindu samsara, the wheel-like structure of the cosmos itself. Basically, they're perpetuating the whirlwind, right? That's why we live in the world. This is all metaphysical grammar. Effectively, the language that they use and the language that they have created themselves, so thus control society, itself has ceded these pre-programmed corpuscles in it. I mean, it's when you start looking into all of this, you realise there's not much of our culture, there's not much of our history, there's not much of our present-day world that isn't, in fact, completely engineered and, well, written from the top down. Everything you're seeing is a world stage. It can't be anything else. I mean, how do you control people en masse and maintain this behemoth of a machine into perpetuity? Well, the only way to do it is to treat human beings like steeds or like crops, which you seed and steer the growth or motion of. And in their mind, you maintain this sort of ignorant, singular focus on what is in front of them, not on what is in fact controlling them as marionette puppets and denying them of agency. They never want you to look into any of this, which is of course why they have written laws so that you're put in jail if you look into certain subjects or speak on certain groups. So yeah, the 5 requirements for lawful recursion or homeostasis, autopoiesis is another term for that. Firstly, to contain a mirror, it must reflect its own essence. 2, stay bounded, it must compress complexity without collapse. 3, handle feedback, it must change without losing core identity. 4, survive collapse, it must break and still remember its structure. This is the idea of human rotational farming. They're moving, the group that controls us right now appears to be moving from the west, and it's moving to the east. Again, there's the rotational farm. What you do is you exploit that field until the crops grow to ripeness, you harvest the crops, and then you leave the field fallow. So you artificially collapse the house of cards, the tabernacle of the con, underneath yourself as you leave for the next field. The next field, of course, appears to be China and Eurasia. And then fifthly, lastly, hold nested identity. It must work recursively at every level, microcosm and macrocosm. So, as we were stating here, it's not just the mass media. It's, of course, every facet, and it's working in a compartmentalised manner, as a holarchy. You would know this as the Matryoshka doll structure. That is how it functions on every level. On every level, the kernel of the worldview of this completely hyper reality that has been established by the scriptwriters is echoed and reverberated. You can't escape it. It will even attach to you in imperceptible ways, just by the general absorption of the cultural milieu in which you are contained within. You can't escape it. Your very mind is being moulded incessantly. Of course, there are ways to mitigate that control, and we can become aware of this playbook of the scriptwriters. But this is the sort of invasive, infective, and all-pervasive nature of this, I guess you would call it a problem. So continuing on with the book. The absence of that process of validation altogether has also been mimicked in this event. The COVID PCR protocol, known as the Corman-Drosten paper, released on the 23rd of January 2020, became the manual of operation for the testing itself regarding this particular supposed infection, and bypassed peer review by being established, or published rather, within a single day. Later, in November 2020, a consortium of 22 scientists signed a paper explaining the scientific fallacies of the Corman-Drosten paper and demanding its retraction. Regardless, the 1968 example shows that what happened in 2020 was entirely known beforehand, not because it was prophetically realised, but because it was planned to be performed as a hoax, as we will contextualise further on. In December 2019, the news about a contagious disease build-up began circulating. According to a National Library of Medicine's article, quote, in December 2019, a series of pneumonia cases of unknown cause emerged in Wuhan, Hubei, China, with clinical presentations greatly resembling viral pneumonia. Deep sequencing analysis from lower respiratory tract samples indicated a novel coronavirus, which was named 2019 novel coronavirus or 2019 nCoV. Unquote. This marked the beginning of the crescendo towards the announcement that would eventually shock the world and cause confusion, hysteria, and disruption. On March 11th, 2020, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus announces that COVID-19 is a global pandemic. It wasn't by chance that earlier I used the example of the Director General of the World Health Organization in relation to similarities with the Catholic Pope, the Tibetan Buddhist Dalai Lama, and the Shintoist Emperor of Japan. At that moment, the Director General of the WHO publicly exerted his authority over the faithful of scientism for the first time and, just like an international religious leader, was blindly obeyed in coordination by most of the national governments. What followed next would have been worthy of a surreal piece of art, perhaps a sequel to the dystopian views of Orwell and Huxley. For those within the worldview, it was a time of terror, be it of being possessed by the purported disease, be it of the economic consequences of the lockdowns, be it regarding the safety of the presented injected Eucharist. For those outside of it, however, the general sensation was that of being forced to watch a B-movie with terrible acting, lousy props and poor special effects. The use of mannequins, this article stands as one example among many. The miscontextualization and outright forgery of imagery, the application of irrational measures with no core scientific reason, but dressed up as scientism, such as the mask only when standing up, regulation and the clear transfer of deaths from other causes attributed to the pandemic, created a completely virtual scenario for the masses. As the dancing nurses videos are a bizarre example of, the majority of the world participated in a mass live-action role-playing game due to the fear, confusion, and blind belief of the collective representative in each psyche, enforced by peer pressure. The back and forth of lockdowns and offered injected Eucharists promoted by the WHO Pope, with the ready compliance of all the faithful member states, governments, using the threat of economic collapse as a motivator of tension to create a shadow representative in the psyche, lasted in most countries until 2022, some even later. The intent behind this chapter is not to thoroughly dissect the event itself and reveal why it could only have been a massive hoax. Others have done so extensively, but to show how such a hoax is not only possible, it is also the rule within the worldview. In the same way that a threat of a deluge, 7 disasters, or bad karma can promote the conversion of an abandoned mind character, so does the perception of an ongoing cataclysm instill that very conversion. The cartoon below, authored by Ben Garrison, is an excellent depiction of the implied conversion by volitional participation in collective rituals, as simply wearing the mask implicitly communicated such messages as written on them. Having very briefly looked at this particular dramatic example from the perspective of its imitation of and effect on the individual psyche, we should now take a look at the hoax indicators listed by authorship of Tim Osman from the Infinite Plane Society in his article, quote, Hoax Indicators and the Informed Disbeliever, unquote, to use as a reference for the analysis of any historical key moments, past, present, and future. In it, Osman states, quote, the skeptical approach begins with the suspension of judgment while the facts can be discovered. If I'm calling something a stage-simulated event, I'm doing so for one of two reasons. 1, there's evidence of it being a fake, or 2, there are indicators of it being fake. If we cannot prove it's fake, but there are hoax indicators. We cannot give it a pass as real. We should instead take the position of the informed disbeliever. This is of key importance because most of the information we are exposed to implies a certain degree of trust in its source. In a healthy psyche, as described in the previous chapters, the ego is the filter of discernment between what should be stored in the memory room as reality, truth, and what should be discarded. This implies not a guessing exercise, but a detection of indicators that reveal inconsistencies with an organic occurrence. This detection capability from the ego, that in healthy circumstances works together with the mind character on the front stage of actual interaction with and perception of the external world, is of existential importance, for it allows recognition of potential threats and of potential benefits that can be stored as, let's call it, wisdom into the memory room. Empirical experience and direct evaluation is far more valuable than external trust, exactly because it implies the exertion of an internal, individual trust that empowers human organic life. The indicators, therefore, provide a list of red flags of questions that need to be checked first, in the same way that a mushroom forager is wise to check for indicators that distinguish between edible and poisonous species. Metaphorically, if we blindly accept the belief in the reality of any historical account, even a present ongoing one, we are risking poisoning our own psyches, becoming dependent on the distribution of small dosages of antidote provided by the promoter of such a poison to keep the psyche in a state resembling life. Also, if we refuse each and every account, we risk missing out on important real clues that may organically come about to build up the mentioned wisdom in our memory rooms. So, the analytic approach, being equivalent to the organic process the ego healthily undertakes, becomes a promoter of good psychological health for the individual. He will no longer become emotionally invested in a given narrative unless he himself validates the occurrence. After all, emotions have all their appropriate and healthy contexts, and all are temporary in nature. If an emotion remains fixed and is fed ad aeternum by the external, one can almost certainly conclude that something artificial or abnormal is occurring to or around that individual. The hoax indicators are listed in that article and are most directed at shooting scenarios presented by mass media, extremely prevalent in the USA, but are applicable entirely in general. To make them more relevant to any scenario, I have adapted them as below and have commented on each point in regards to the COVID-19 scenario mentioned. 1. Ready to implement political agendas. Real events tend not to have the problem reaction solution template attached. In essence, there's no prefigured solutions inbuilt within the scenario. Immediate regulation was presented as part of the solution to prevent information contradictory to the narrative of the pandemic. Many were implemented regionally during the event itself, but the subsequent pandemic agreement finalised by the WHO in May 2025, granting international powers to its centralised papacy, reveals a huge chunk of the political agenda behind the drama. 2. Crisis actors. Mass casualty simulations employ actors, as do simulated news events. These are characteristically exhibiting inappropriate emotions. Many are seemingly coached in their testimony, and oftentimes their version of events are inconsistent with the official story. Indeed, there were countless performances of supposed COVID patients, as well as the previously mentioned usage of mannequins, all part of drills which will be significant for another hoax indicator, broadcast in media back then. An example of such crisis actors, as these performers came to be known over the years, can be found in the following link. I leave the analysis of the performance and the discernment of accepting it as real or fake up to the reader. This is an Odyssey link. I'll provide the link to the book and all of these various links will be found in, of course, the book itself. 3. Relevant concurrent programming in contemporaneous entertainment media. Concurrently released mainstream entertainment indicate the event was scheduled to occur at that time and was not a spontaneous occurrence. The examples given earlier of concurrent Netflix documentaries about the very same pandemic themes should be enough to tick this box. Still, the series Outbreak, whose season finale aired on the 10th of March 2020, one exact day before the WHO pandemic announcement, represents an even clearer example of this method. Again, concurrent programming. 4. Concurrent drills that align with the theme of the fake event. Event 201 in November 2019, presented earlier, is not the only example of a concurrent drill, but it is the most encompassing, as it showed rehearsed responses that would be applied later during the actual event performance. 5. Celebrity involvement in an event is a good indicator that it is an influence operation. Many musicians, politicians, and actors got involved in the public promotion of the pandemic. The following article by USA Today is an example that reveals a cast of celebrities promoting not only the reality of the event, but also proposed Eucharistic solutions. That is from USA Today, with the headline, "What Tom Hanks, Jamie Foxx, more celebs saying face masks on face masks." 6. Does the perpetrator reference other questionable events? Does the perpetrator fit a predictable stereotype targeted at striking fear into a target demographic? In the case at hand, the perpetrator is the purported COVID-19 virus. It is a call back to previous foreshadowing culprits, such as the bird flu, H1N1, HIV, and the swine flu virus. The latter had, in 1976, a quite interesting and related incident as depicted in the following report by CBS 60 Minutes to set the stage for reference decades later. Additionally, the target demographic of the whole event was mostly individuals who were aligned with scientism, a religious framework that, as I discussed earlier, joined together people of all cultures and creeds. The believers then enforced the new faith among their circles. 7. Deviations from standard protocol with law enforcement and emergency response personnel. If the event scenes are treated more like a movie set, doubts should be raised. The law enforcement response was completely outside of standard protocol, with belief more than actual legality acting as basis. Supposedly, people were arrested at beaches or for breaking a curfew when no legal martial law was declared anywhere. Also, there were several reports of hospitals less busy than usual, which seems to be the case due to the epidemic of videos of masked idle nurses dancing to the Jerusalema song. Law enforcement was performing, aware of it or not, a bad cop movie on the set of The World. The nurses turned that movie set into a lighter musical. Humour aside, the absence of peer reviewing in the key papers that acted as manuals for the PCR testing as a process of diagnosis, as well as the speed at which the vaccines were produced and presented without proper validation and testing, were clear breaches of protocol as well. 8. Does the event unfold according to a predictable template? The template was defined not only by Event 201, but also by previous such simulations. The pandemic followed the responses that had been rehearsed in them, thus being predictable. 9. The event triggers a perfectly bifurcated response, so the left and the right can agree it was real, but each in such a way to allow to scapegoat the other side for it. There were clear bifurcations generated by the event. Firm believers and compliers were set on one side, while doubters and detractors were corralled on the other. In the middle, there was a grey area of individuals merely caught in the confusion. It also subsequently generated a bifurcation of pro and anti, with the pro being in favour of mandatory enforcement of measures to tackle the perceived threat, such as the needlecraft, and the anti being adamantly against even the voluntary choice being available. Both sides treated the other as a threat. The pro considered the un-needlecrafted a threat for spreading the disease, while the anti considered the needlecrafted the threat for spreading a purported spike protein that would be harmful to any who came into contact. 10. The story is given disproportionate attention, nationally or internationally. I believe this point is self-evident and dispenses commentary, given that the matter dominated the news cycles internationally for well over a year, or of course more. 11. The public is goaded into participation in GoFundMe campaigns, hashtags, or activism with the introduction of martyrs and heroes. The martyrs will, of course, be villains to one side of the political spectrum, and the heroes will similarly appear as villains to the opposite side. There were several campaigns ongoing at the time that motivated participation and virtue signalling on the part of the masses. Wearing a mask proudly or filming oneself being needlecrafted became a matter of social acceptability, for example. 12. Scooby-Doo Justice. The event has a rapid investigation and development, like an episode of a cartoon. The good guys unmask the culprit at the end. The pandemic hadn't even yet been declared, and the culprit had already been caught on video. This is similar to, of course, Osama bin Laden and the whole event in 2001. I mean, as soon as it occurred, they already knew who was behind it, who the culprit was. And then you have, of course, not just the Scooby-Doo Justice, but the Mickey Mouse logic, where, everything burned up. In the various plane impacts on that event in 2001, bar the passports of the alleged hijackers. They all survived, so they could, of course, again, deal out the Scooby-Doo justice, right? Where, again, they found the culprits almost instantaneously. Again, because it ensures narrative control. They have to steer the narrative. So to steer the narrative, you have to control it from its outset. You can't do that if you leave things, up to happen chance, or if you, wait a couple of months or 6 months to find the culprit. It has to be instantaneous, because you have to steer the narrative from the beginning to ensure that the false worldview is given an air of legitimacy and authoritative power. So continuing on with Àrmunn's comments, the famous bat soup footage became the symbol of the source of the event. There you go, that's Mickey Mouse logic, right? There as well, including Scooby-Doo Justice. Side by side with emerging alternative theories such as the lab escape and the bioweapon narratives. All such theories treat the central premise as real. That is, all of them take for granted the factual existence of the COVID-19 virus as presented, with all its bizarre behaviour. Thus, we can verify how the 2020 dramatic event ticked all the boxes in the hoax indicators list. I will leave the conclusions about this particular case to each individual reader, because it is not my intention to indoctrinate, only to share my findings on the human psyche. Still, it may be a recommended exercise to keep this list close and reanalyze history moments accordingly. Also, it may come in handy for any future concurrent history writing occurrences. Another thing to mention on the event in 2001, this is just more of my own comments on it. Again, regarding the Mickey Mouse logic, 3 months prior to that event in 2001, in the month of September, we had news reports that Osama bin Laden had died. I forget where it was now. Yeah, in the mountains of Tora Bora, right? The CIA asset. However, he supposedly, went on to live for years and years and years until, of course, SEAL Team 6, in that other Scooby-Doo Justice, Mickey Mouse logic event, again, like an episode of a cartoon, a total caricature of reality. They took him out, and, by the way, all of the SEAL Team 6 members, I believe, died in suspicious circumstances afterwards. One of them, in fact, told their father, basically, that, they were up to their neck in corruption, and, their life was on the line. And a week after he died, I believe they all died it was a helicopter accident, if I do recall. So again, that's them, the control system tying up loose ends with these actors, or scurrying the actors away off the stage because they're no longer required. But anyway, yes, Osama bin Laden's body supposedly was dumped at sea, right? Totally Scooby-Doo justice and Mickey Mouse logic, a total caricature of what you would expect. But if people believe that, what they do as well is they almost automatically give up a part of their agency. If they can believe the incredible, the far-fetched, they are basically primed to believe anything. A gradual, incremental move towards ensuring that they completely relinquish all agency over their organic self, and to provide that, to externalize that in the control system itself. So continuing on, Chapter 6, Afterwards. I've done what I could to present in a literary format. That is not my natural field, man's psyche as I observe it. Not only its structure, but also the way it works, and how it is led by mimicry and simulation of organic perception. The trigger to such virtual worldviews of perception is an initial rejection of unpredictability, which causes a lack of trust in the ego by the mind character, thus compromising the connection between the two. The verifiable act that we now increasingly are set in a low-trust society or worldview proves that the external tries to imitate that very individual condition. Yet it does so with the intent to bring about another false high-trust society that will act as a soothing replacement for a while. At the collective level, it is obvious, then, that the writers of worldviews include in their narratives this process of rejection, inception, projection, expansion, and reflection, contraction, exactly because they match organic individual psychological processes. It can be argued that we live in a dark age, even though we, due to the belief in the collective shadow surrogate, think we are all collectively enlightened. I am not a pessimist when I say there is no collective solution to the problem. I'm simply being realistic, for the collective itself is the very flammable wood upon which the problem ignites and burns. We are, as man, naturally gregarious, yet we are, first and foremost, individuals. It is at the individual level that our true sphere of influence and responsibility resides. Only by becoming whole within ourselves can we hope to engage with others in a complete, productive, and elevating manner. This requires accepting that unpredictability is an inherent aspect of organic life, balanced by an equal measure of routine. If we attempt to control entirely the individuality intrinsic to us, we inevitably lose it, and consequently, we also forfeit the richness of collective experience. The collective, through the influence of a minority of worldview builders, has become a control freak at the level of its very psyche. It has been converted into a religious framework that exalts imbalance, leaning toward either of the two natural poles of existence, order or chaos. For this reason, the worldview is always drawn to shift cyclically between these two extremes, like a pendulum, in its attempt at self-perpetuation. Yet this is not necessarily an attack. Remember, conflict is what both sustains and eventually dissolves the shadow, but rather an individual test one in which the internal processes of our own psyches must be uncovered, and our interactions with the collective consciously observed. In a very literal way, at the individual and psychological level, our mind characters, once reconnected to the ego, must become iconoclasts, shattering the false idols of the worldview, not through violence, which, as shown, only feeds it further, but through realization, through the clear seeing of what it truly is. Indeed, a painting of a tree is not the tree itself. Thus, destroying the image of the tree within us does not destroy the original. It restores our connection to its living form. For that reason, reconnection with our legitimate, organic ego is the essential step. In his 1883 poem Glosa, the Romanian poet Mihai Eminescu captured what I believe to be an essential key to the individual path. I end this work with his words, hoping that his exploration has, in some measure, served you. Glosa by Mihai Eminescu. Time goes by, time comes along. All is old and all is new. What is right and what is wrong, you must think and ask of you. Have no hope and have no fear. Waves that rise can never hold. If they urge or if they cheer, you remain aloof and cold. To our sight a lot will glisten, many sounds will reach our ear. Who could take the time to listen and remember all we hear? Keep aside all that patter, seek yourself far from the throng. When with loud and idle clatter, time goes by, time comes along. Nor forget the tongue of reason, or its even scales depress, when the moment-changing season wears the mask of happiness. It is born of reason's slumber, and may last a wink as true, for the one who knows its number. All is old, and all is new. Be as to a play spectator, as the world unfolds before. You will know the heart of matter, should they act 2 parts or 4. When they cry or tear asunder, from your seat enjoy along, and you'll learn from art to wonder what is right and what is wrong. Past and future, ever blending, are the twin sides of same page. New start will begin with ending, when you know to learn from age. All that was or be tomorrow, we have in the present too. But what's vain and futile sorrow, you must think and ask of you. For the living cannot sever from the means we've always had, now as years ago and ever. Men are happy or are sad. Other masks, same play repeated, different tongues, same words to hear. Of your dreams so often cheated, have no hope and have no fear. Hope not when the villains cluster, by success and glory drawn. Fools with perfect lack of lustre will outshine Hyperion. Fear it not, they'll push each other to reach higher in the fold. Do not side with them as brother, waves that rise can never hold. Sounds of siren songs call steady, toward golden nets astray. Life attracts you into eddies, to change actors in the play. Steal aside from crowd and bustle, do not look, seem not to hear. From your path away from hustle, if they urge or if they cheer. If they reach for you, go faster, hold your tongue when slanders yell. Your advice they cannot master, don't you know their measure well? Let them talk and let them chatter, let all go past young and old. Unattached to man or matter, you remain aloof and cold. You remain aloof and cold. They urge or if they cheer, waves that rise can never hold, have no hope and have no fear. You must think and ask of you what is right and what is wrong. All is old and all is new. Time goes by. Time comes along. Acknowledgements to Sayo for all the radiance, love and support, to Kazumbo for the motivation and innate brightness, to Osman for the philosophical insights and inspiration, to Regan for the pertinent collaboration, to Silas for reviewing and for the deep discussions, to Linda for the innate connection. And with that concludes the great work titled Man's Psyche, The Two Worlds by Àrmunn.